In the long memory of human seafaring, the ocean has never been a blank stage, never just water stretching endlessly in every direction. For those who set sail into its shifting expanse, it was always alive, a force with moods, hungers, and secrets. Waves that towered without warning, storms that erupted from nothing, and shadows that passed just beneath the hull. These were not accidents of nature in the eyes of early sailors. They were signs of a presence, a will, an unseen inhabitant of the deep. For generations, mariners whispered about a creature so vast that to glimpse it was to confront the ocean's raw authority. They called it the Kraken. The stories did not emerge all at once. They grew like coral, layer upon layer, as different crews returned with accounts of shapes in the water that defied belief. Sometimes it was the sudden rise of a dark island where no land should be, only for that island to shift, ripple, and vanish beneath the waves. Sometimes it was a forest of arms, long and twisting, breaking the surface in a circle around a ship, as though the sea itself had learned to reach upward and grasp. And sometimes it was simply the sense of being watched from below, of something massive moving with slow intent, unseen but undeniable. The northern seas were the birthplace of the legend. The men who ventured into the frigid waters around Norway, Iceland, and Greenland carried these tales home.
Their livelihoods depended on sailing into some of the most unpredictable waters on Earth, where sudden storms, rogue waves, and volcanic activity shaped the world in ways that seemed almost alive. It was there, amid a landscape of shifting islands and black depths, that the Kraken found its first form. Sailors said it could drag whole ships under, that it could whip the sea into a whirlpool by simply moving, that its tentacles could wrap around a vessel's hull and splinter it like kindling. The image was terrifying not only because of its violence, but because of its scale. This was not a shark, not a whale, not a predator of ordinary size. This was a monster that embodied the abyss itself. To the men who told these stories, the ocean was never empty. It was filled with presences, each with their own will. The Kraken was the largest and most feared, but it was part of a continuum. Whales were already giants, their spouts rising like geysers beside fragile wooden boats. Squids washed up on beaches with arms long enough to coil around a man. But the Kraken was something more, something that took those real glimpses of strangeness and magnified them into myth. It was not just a giant animal. It was the ocean-made flesh, the embodiment of everything that could not be predicted or controlled. The first descriptions that survive in writing show how quickly the Kraken moved from rumor to myth. In the 13th century, the Norwegian king Sverris Saga described a sea creature so vast that men mistook its back for land, only to find it sinking beneath them. Later, the Icelandic bishop Pontoppidan would write in the 18th century about a beast that appeared like an island ringed by fish that swarmed near its body. These fish, the bishop claimed, were a gift to fishermen, but also a curse, because to linger too long meant to risk being dragged down when the monster dove. In these accounts, the Kraken was more than a predator. It was a lure, a temptation, a test of greed. What made the legend so enduring was its ambiguity. Sailors swore they had seen it, yet no two descriptions matched exactly. Some spoke of a mountain rising from the sea, others of tentacles like a forest, others of whirlpools that pulled vessels down with irresistible force. The Kraken was always just out of reach of certainty, and in that uncertainty it became larger than life. It was not a single creature, but a category of experience. Every unexplained crash of water, every sudden current, every monstrous carcass that washed ashore became proof of its existence. To stand on the deck of a small wooden ship, surrounded on all sides by endless dark water, was to know how fragile humans truly were. A single storm could erase a crew from history. A single mistake in navigation could doom them to starvation. And yet beyond these known dangers, there lingered the possibility of something deliberate beneath the waves, something alive that chose when to appear and when to vanish. The Kraken filled that gap between natural disaster and personal malice. It was not just the sea being dangerous, it was the sea as a predator. The sailors who first told these stories were not fools. They were practical men whose lives depended on reading the weather, understanding currents, and recognizing the difference between a wave and a reef. To them, the Kraken was not a childish fantasy. It was a working explanation for the things they saw, things that could not be accounted for by their knowledge of the natural world. When a ship vanished without trace, swallowed by a sudden whirlpool, the Kraken was the cause. When a catch of fish appeared so dense that nets nearly broke with the weight, it was because the monster's massive body drew them close. The legend grew because it explained the inexplicable. Over time, the Kraken became part of a larger seafaring vocabulary, a way of speaking about the hazards of the deep. To invoke its name was to express awe and fear in equal measure. It was not always described as purely hostile. Some accounts painted it as almost indifferent, a vast being whose presence shaped the sea around it, but who had no interest in humans unless they came too close. This made it even more unnerving. A monster that seeks you out can at least be fought or evaded. A monster that does not care whether you live or die, one that kills simply by existing, is far more terrifying. The image of the Kraken also shifted with time. Early depictions leaned towards something whale-like, an island beast that rose and sank. Later, as reports of giant squids filtered into northern lore, the tentacles became central. By the 18th and 19th centuries, illustrations showed a colossal cephalopod, arms coiling around masts, eyes the size of sails, and beaks that could splinter wood. These changing images reveal how myths evolve not in spite of reality, but in dialogue with it. The more men saw of the real ocean, the more details the Kraken absorbed, until it became a synthesis of everything frightening about the deep. It is important to remember that in the centuries when the Kraken legend flourished, the ocean was still largely unmapped. Vast regions of the sea were blank spaces on charts, filled with speculative drawings of monsters. To sail into those spaces was to sail into uncertainty, and the Kraken became a shorthand for that uncertainty itself. It was not merely a monster, it was a symbol of the unknown, a warning that the sea would always hold more than humans could imagine. The stories spread because they fit the environment in which they were told. A world of sailors, fishermen, and explorers needed names for the forces that dwarfed them. The Kraken was not simply entertainment around the fire, it was part of the language of survival. To hear that another crew had vanished in the north, their ship splintered and gone, was to be reminded that the Kraken still waited. And whether one believed in it literally or not, the effect was the same, a deep, visceral respect for the sea's power. As the tales traveled beyond the northern world, they began to change in tone. To those who lived by the sea, the Kraken was a presence to be endured, a risk that came with the work. To those who only read of it, in towns and cities far from the water, it became a spectacle, a story of horror and marvel. Writers turned it into an emblem of the alien and the terrifying, something that could swallow a fleet and vanish without trace. In these retellings, the Kraken grew even larger, even more impossible, until it was less a creature than an apocalypse waiting beneath the waves. The line between myth and history blurred as chroniclers recorded the stories with the same weight as real events. The Kraken was written into natural histories, described alongside whales and walruses as though it were simply another animal of the northern seas. Learned men debated whether it was a fish, a cephalopod, or some unique category of monster. What gave these discussions credibility was the sheer consistency of reports. Too many men, from too many ships, told too many similar tales for the creature to be dismissed outright. At the heart of all these stories was a single idea: the sea is not ours. We may cross it, we may harvest it, but we do not control it. The Kraken was a reminder of that truth, an image of the abyss that lay beneath every calm surface. Even when the winds were still and the waters glassy, sailors knew that below them lay a world larger, darker, and stranger than they could ever master. The Kraken was the face they gave that world, the mask they placed on the fear that followed them into every voyage. It was never just a monster of the imagination. It was a reflection of the human condition at sea. To sail was to gamble, to place your life on a fragile hull and trust that the forces beyond your control would not crush you. To return alive was to tell stories, and those stories took shape in the form of monsters. The Kraken became the greatest of them, the one that embodied all the others, not because it was seen often, but because it was never seen clearly. It thrived in uncertainty, in the shadows of memory and rumor, where fear grows largest. And so the legend endured, not in spite of its vagueness, but because of it. A monster that can never be pinned down, can never be disproven. Each wave that rose without warning, each shadow that passed under the hull, each storm that swallowed a crew, became another whisper of its presence. And with each whisper, the Kraken grew. The sea has always hidden its secrets in motion. A mountain of water can rise, travel, and collapse before a ship has time to adjust its course. A school of fish can churn the surface into a boiling patch of silver and vanish as if swallowed by the water itself. Against this ever-changing backdrop, the line between what is ordinary and what is monstrous has never been clear. Sailors returning from long voyages spoke of shapes that surfaced suddenly in the waves, forms so large and strange that they could only belong to something beyond the familiar world of whales and fish. These were the first sightings of what would be remembered as the Kraken. And though each account differed in detail, they carried the same undertone of awe and dread. For many, the first glimpse was not a beast, but a landscape. Men at sea described sailing past an island that seemed to rise from nowhere. It was dark, irregular, covered in what looked like ridges or forests. Some swore that smoke rose faintly from it, as though fires burned on its back. Crews dropped anchor, even landed on its surface, only to feel it shift beneath their feet. The island would quiver, tilt, and sink, dragging anchors and boats with it. Later, those men would claim they had stood on the Kraken itself. Whether these memories were born from volcanic activity, floating masses of pumice, or illusions of tired eyes, the stories spread quickly. They painted a picture of a creature so large that ships could mistake it for solid land. Not every sighting was so grand. Some began with a ripple at the edge of vision. A patch of water darkened unnaturally, as though a shadow moved just below the surface. Then came the disturbance, a whirlpool forming without warning, a sudden swell that knocked men from their feet. Sometimes what followed was a forest of arms rising silently into the air, long, twisting, boneless limbs that writhed against the sky. They reached out in all directions, curling and uncurling, as if the sea itself had grown hands and was feeling its way across the surface. The arms did not always strike, but their presence alone was enough. To see them was to know you were in the grip of something immeasurable. Accounts written down centuries later show how these first glimpses were interpreted. In old Norwegian stories, the Kraken was not only feared for its violence, but noted for the signs that preceded its appearance. Men said the sea would fill with fish before it rose. Nets would strain with catches so heavy they threatened to break. The creature's vast body supposedly attracted swarms of fish that gathered around it, and clever fishermen risked approaching the beast to take advantage. This bounty came at a cost. To linger too long meant being caught when the creature finally surfaced. In this way, the Kraken was both gift and curse, temptation and doom. It was not simply an enemy. It was a presence that forced choices, forcing men to weigh greed against survival. As sailors tried to make sense of what they saw, they began to give the monster shape. Some described it as flat and broad, others as round like a floating mountain. The eyes were rarely glimpsed, but when they were said to be the size of dinner plates, gleaming just above the surface. Its mouth, hidden beneath the waves, was imagined as vast enough to swallow a ship whole. Yet the most enduring feature was always the arms. Sailors spoke of tentacles so long that they could wrap around a vessel and drag it down. Illustrators who heard these tales later sketched images of ships entangled, masts breaking as the coils tightened. These pictures became part of the collective imagination, reinforcing what words alone could not convey. There is a striking consistency in the fear these stories describe. The ocean was already hostile, filled with storms, reefs, and currents. Yet the Kraken was not simply another danger, it was intentional. Storms struck at random, but the Kraken seemed to choose. It appeared at the worst possible time, when sails were slack, when crews were weary, when ships were overburdened with catch. In those moments, the sea revealed its will through a living body, and the shape in the waves became an adversary with its own hunger. Some of the earliest natural histories tried to rationalize these reports while still treating the Kraken as real. The Norwegian bishop Erik Pontoppidan, writing in the 18th century, insisted that the monster was a genuine creature of extraordinary size. He gathered sailors' stories, compared them, and concluded that it was likely a massive species of squid or crab. Yet even he could not resist describing its immense scale, calling it the largest creature in the ocean. His writings preserved the ambiguity that had always surrounded the Kraken. It was treated as both natural and supernatural, a beast of flesh and blood, but also a symbol of the ocean's unfathomable power. The persistence of these sightings speaks to the way human perception bends under stress. A sailor peering into a foggy horizon, exhausted from days without rest, might mistake a wave crest for the rise of a back. A cluster of whales surfacing together could seem like a single, vast creature. A giant squid, rarely seen but occasionally washed ashore, could explain the arms that haunted the tales. Each glimpse was partial, each detail distorted, but together they built a composite image that grew larger with every telling. The Kraken was less a single encounter than a collection of impressions stitched together across generations. Despite the uncertainty, there were those who swore they had been close enough to touch it. One story told of a ship sailing near Greenland when the waters began to heave. The men looked over the side to see a monstrous eye staring back at them, larger than the porthole it filled.
Panic spread through the crew, but before the beast struck, it sank silently beneath the waves, leaving only turbulence behind. Others claimed they had seen its arms wrapped around whales, dragging them down in a struggle that turned the sea red. These were not merely shadows or tricks of light. They were encounters that left scars in memory, even if no physical proof survived. The spread of these stories through ports and taverns gave the Kraken a kind of immortality. Each retelling added something new. A survivor of one voyage would swear the monster's breath stank of decay. Another would insist it made a low moaning sound as it rose. Another claimed it could spit ink across the waves to blind its prey. These additions did not replace older details, but layered on top of them, until the Kraken became a patchwork of every terror the sea could inspire. For men who relied on the ocean for their lives, the stories were not just entertainment. They were warnings, encoded knowledge about the dangers of the sea. To hear of a ship that had vanished in a whirlpool was to be reminded that such forces existed. To hear of tentacles crushing a vessel was to be reminded that the sea contained life beyond imagining. Belief in the Kraken was not naive. It was a rational way of acknowledging that the ocean could not be fully known. In these early sightings, we see the foundation of a pattern. The Kraken was never just a creature glimpsed once.
It was always encountered again by different men in different seas, each time taking on new shape. This repetition gave it authority. A lone story might be dismissed as madness. A chorus of stories spread across decades and oceans demanded attention. The Kraken became real not because anyone captured it, but because too many swore they had seen its shadow. Even as knowledge of the seas expanded, the shapes in the waves did not vanish. Explorers mapping new coasts, merchants crossing to distant markets, and whalers chasing their prey all carried the possibility of an encounter. And when a strange turbulence rose beside a ship, when a sudden whirlpool opened in calm water, when tentacles broke the surface and vanished again, the explanation was ready. The Kraken had shown itself once more, and so the image of the monster grew, sustained by sightings that no map or instrument could erase, feeding the sense that beneath every wave lay a presence waiting to rise. What began as fleeting glimpses became a figure that shaped not only stories, but the way men understood the sea itself. The earliest stories of the Kraken do not come from distant lands or imagined oceans. They come from the north itself, from the harsh waters where it was said to dwell. Norway, Iceland, and Greenland were the landscapes that gave it shape. The men who first told its stories were not detached observers. They were fishermen and sailors who depended entirely on the sea for their survival. In the sagas of these northern people, the ocean was not just a setting for adventure. It was a living, unpredictable force, and within it swam creatures that blurred the line between animal and myth. The Kraken was one of them. The old Norse sagas were filled with monsters, giants, and beasts that tested human strength. Dragons coiled around treasure, trolls haunted the mountains, and serpents writhed beneath the earth. Yet the sea was the greatest frontier, and its terrors were often described with the same weight as the enemies on land. Among these terrors, none captured the imagination more than the vast beings said to rise from the depths. The Kraken was not always named in the earliest texts, but the descriptions are familiar. An island that moved, a beast that swallowed ships whole, a shape so large that it defied comprehension. One of the oldest references comes from the 13th century saga of King Sverre of Norway. In it, sailors are warned of a monstrous sea creature that rises from the depths like an island. This was not just a tale to frighten men.
It was treated as practical knowledge, something a wise captain needed to know to avoid disaster. To mistake the creature for land and anchor near it was to court death, for when it sank, it dragged everything down with it. The story reflects the practical seafaring world of the Norse. Legends were not entertainment alone. They were survival guides wrapped in myth. The Kraken was sometimes conflated with another giant of the northern seas, the Hafgufa. This word, meaning sea mist or sea steam, referred to a creature so vast that men mistook its back for rocks. In some tales, it opened its mouth wide and emitted a scent that lured fish into its maw, swallowing entire shoals in one gulp. This detail of the luring breath, combined with the enormous scale, shows how close the Hafgufa was to the later Kraken. Over time, the two names became interchangeable, each feeding the legend of the other until they merged into a single monstrous archetype. The sagas show a fascinating pattern in the way the monster is described. It is not always depicted as aggressive. Sometimes it is a passive hazard, a living island that men must avoid. Other times, it is actively hostile, dragging vessels beneath the waves. This inconsistency reveals much about its role in the Norse imagination. The sea itself was not always violent, but it was always dangerous. Some days it offered calm waters and plentiful fish. Other days it rose in storms that smashed ships to pieces.
The Kraken mirrored this duality. It could ignore you, or it could kill you, depending on chance or fate. The language of the sagas emphasized scale. Words like vast, enormous, and unfathomable recur again and again. This was no ordinary whale or shark. This was something that made the greatest known creatures look small. The sheer size of the kraken was as terrifying as its actions. A beast so large that it appeared to be an island was not just an enemy. It was a presence that dwarfed humanity, a living reminder of how small a man was against the ocean. The Norse were not alone in describing such beings. Medieval maps from northern Europe often depicted monstrous figures in the margins of the sea. Tentacled beasts coiling around ships, huge fish swallowing men, and other hybrids filled the spaces where geography was uncertain. These images were not mere decoration. They were visual echoes of the same stories told in sagas and taverns. They marked the places where men feared the kraken might rise. There is an important detail in these northern accounts that would shape the legend for centuries: the association between the kraken and fishing. Sailors believed that the monster's presence brought vast numbers of fish to the surface. This detail appears again and again, from the oldest sagas to later natural histories. It reveals the practical logic behind the myth. In regions where survival depended on catching enough fish, any unusual abundance needed an explanation. To see a sea teeming with life might have been interpreted not as luck, but as a sign of the kraken lurking beneath. The bounty was a warning, a temptation to take what you could and flee before the monster rose. In this way, the kraken embodied one of the most important themes of Norse myth, the test of restraint. Heroes in the sagas were often destroyed not by external enemies, but by their own hubris, their inability to resist greed or pride. The kraken fit perfectly into this moral landscape. Those who respected the signs, who took only what they needed and left, survived. Those who lingered too long trying to seize more than their share were dragged down to the depths. The monster was not only a terror, it was a teacher. As the centuries passed, the kraken became part of the shared imagination of the North. It was not only a local legend told among fishermen, it became a symbol of the sea itself, a shorthand for everything vast, mysterious, and dangerous about the ocean. Poets invoked it to convey awe, chroniclers recorded it as though it were fact, and sailors spoke of it as a presence they might truly encounter. In the Norse worldview, where gods walked among men and giants dwelled beyond the edges of the world, the kraken was entirely plausible. The blending of myth and lived experience gave the kraken its longevity. Unlike some monsters that belonged only to mythic time, the kraken lived in the here and now. It was not banished to the past or confined to distant lands. It was said to be out there still, rising and sinking in the northern seas. This immediacy made it a constant presence in the imagination, always a possibility on the next voyage. The sagas also reveal the way the kraken fit into a larger pattern of sea monsters. The Midgard serpent, Jörmungandr, encircled the world beneath the waves, destined to rise at Ragnarök and bring about the end of days. The kraken was not so cosmic in scale, but it shared the same logic. The ocean was home to beings larger than imagination, forces that could not be defeated by human strength. Both the serpent and the kraken conveyed the same truth, that the sea was a domain beyond human mastery, a place where primordial powers waited. The memory of these stories endured even as Christianity spread across the north. Monks recording natural histories included the kraken alongside real animals, treating it as one more marvel of God's creation. To them, it was not a pagan myth, but evidence of the Creator's power. If whales and elephants existed, why not a monster so vast that it could be mistaken for land? The shift from myth to theology did not weaken the kraken, it reinforced it, embedding the legend into the framework of Christian belief. By the time the Renaissance brought new maps and wider voyages, the kraken was already deeply rooted in northern culture. Explorers carried the tales with them, and writers across Europe began to repeat them. The monster of the sagas became a monster of the world, no longer confined to Norway or Iceland. It was drawn into a global vocabulary of sea monsters, its name spreading as far as the Mediterranean and beyond. But its heart remained in the north, in the sagas and stories that first gave it shape. These tales are essential not only because they preserve the first descriptions of the Kraken, but because they reveal how the monster functioned. It was never just a predator. It was a sign, a test, a lesson about the dangers of the sea and the limits of human ambition. To the Norse, whose lives depended on navigating those waters, the Kraken was both a real threat and a symbolic reminder. It was the ocean made visible, the abyss given tentacles and teeth. And as the stories grew, they began to change the way people imagined the sea itself. The Kraken was not only in the waves, it was the waves. It was the rising of the water, the sudden abundance of fish, the whirlpool that appeared from nowhere. It was the embodiment of the sea as a living being, not a neutral expanse, but a force with moods and judgments, as ready to provide as it was to destroy. The old stories of the North and the sightings carried home by sailors reveal something larger than the monster itself. They show how people once regarded the ocean. To them, it was not an empty surface or a neutral backdrop against which their voyages played out. It was alive. The sea was not just a setting. It was a character in every sense, with moods, hungers, and intentions. In that worldview, it was only natural that a being like the Kraken should exist. For men who spent weeks or months at sea, the water around them never felt inert. It breathed and shifted. It rose up in sudden swells, rolled in long sighs, and struck with unpredictable fury. It had voices, the constant slap of waves against the hull, the deep groaning of timbers strained by pressure, the whistling of wind through rigging that merged with the roar of water until the boundary between air and sea blurred. It was no wonder that sailors spoke of the ocean as if it were a living force, capable of rage, patience, or trickery. The Kraken was only one face of this larger presence. Even in the earliest myths, the sea was personified. The Greeks spoke of Poseidon, Stormbringer, whose moods shook the earth itself. The Mesopotamians told of Tiamat, the primordial sea dragon whose body was carved into the world. For the Norse, the sea serpent encircling the earth was both landscape and monster. Across cultures, water was always imagined as an animate power, and every voyage into it was a negotiation with that power. The Kraken was not invented from nothing. It was a local expression of a universal truth, that the sea could never be trusted to remain still. For northern sailors, this sense of life was not metaphor, it was lived experience. A calm morning could turn to chaos within hours. The same route sailed dozens of times could suddenly present new hazards, a hidden reef, an unfamiliar current, a fog that swallowed the horizon. To men whose survival depended on predicting these changes, the sea's unpredictability was indistinguishable from intention. It behaved as if it chose when to help and when to kill. To make sense of that, it was natural to give it faces, to imagine it as creatures that acted out its will. The Kraken was one of those faces, the embodiment of the sea's hostility when it decided to strike. But the sea was not only destructive, it was also generous, and that too was seen as part of its character. Nets came up bursting with fish, whales were hunted for oil and meat, and trade routes carried wealth across waters that might have just as easily drowned their ships. Sailors spoke of the sea providing as much as it punished, rewarding those who respected it. The Kraken reflected this dual nature. It brought fish in swarms, yet threatened to consume the men who lingered. It was the sea's generosity turned into temptation, a reminder that every gift carried danger. The notion of the ocean as a living being shaped how maps were drawn and how journeys were remembered. Medieval maps often showed waves with faces, ships tossed not by chance, but by visible monsters. Margins of the known world teemed with illustrated leviathans, their coils and fins merging with the water itself. The unknown sea was not imagined as empty white space, but as populated, animated, full of forces waiting to be encountered. This was not decoration. It was a worldview. To sail into uncharted water was to sail into another creature's body. This way of seeing was not confined to the north. In Polynesian traditions, the ocean was filled with ancestors and spirits, each wave a manifestation of their presence. In Japan, tales of giant sea creatures told of beings who punished arrogance and rewarded humility. In the Mediterranean, mermaids, sirens, and sea monsters filled the same role. The sea was alive everywhere, and it demanded respect. In the north, where waters were colder, darker, and less forgiving, the Kraken was the natural heir of that idea. What makes this perspective striking is that it has never entirely disappeared. Even now, with satellites and sonar, we still speak of the sea as if it has moods. Weather reports describe angry waters. Storm surges are said to attack coastlines. Ships are swallowed by waves. These are metaphors, but they reveal the persistence of older ways of thinking. The Kraken may no longer be feared as literal truth, but the sense that the sea itself can rise against us remains deeply ingrained. The living character of the ocean also explains why the Kraken was not dismissed as a single isolated myth. It fit too neatly into the larger pattern of how the sea was understood. When sailors saw something strange, when they witnessed shapes too vast to name, it was natural to fold those sights into the ongoing story of the ocean's will. If the sea could breathe, then it could also give birth. If it could rage, then it could have limbs. The Kraken was simply the most vivid expression of the truth they already believed, that the sea was never passive. The strongest proof of this worldview is how consistently the Kraken's legend was tied to human behavior. It did not appear at random, it appeared in response. To take too much fish, to linger too long in its waters, to mistake its body for land, these were acts of arrogance that provoked the monster's rise. This mirrored the way sailors spoke of the sea in general. Those who respected it, who read its signs and obeyed its limits, survived. Those who grew careless or greedy were punished. The Kraken was a way of telling that lesson in flesh and bone. There is also a psychological truth buried in this view of the sea as alive. To be surrounded on all sides by water, with no land in sight, is to experience a form of isolation unlike anything else. The mind fills that void with presence. The creak of the hull becomes a heartbeat. The crash of waves becomes breathing. The endless horizon becomes a face that watches. The Kraken is what happens when that presence takes form. It is the projection of human awareness onto an environment too vast to comprehend, a monster born not only of the sea's violence, but of the mind's need to personify it. When later generations tried to strip the legend down to biology, pointing to giant squids as its real origin, they overlooked this deeper function. The Kraken was never just about a strange animal. It was about the sea itself. The squid explained the tentacles, but not the way the monster embodied greed, punishment, and inevitability. To treat it only as a zoological error is to miss its role as the living mask of the ocean. The men who first told the stories did not care whether it was an animal or a spirit. To them, the distinction was meaningless. The sea was alive either way, and the Kraken was proof. This understanding of the ocean as animate also shaped rituals and customs. Sailors poured offerings overboard before dangerous crossings. They whispered prayers into the wind when storms gathered. They knocked on wood, crossed themselves, or avoided certain words at sea to prevent offending the waters. These acts only make sense if the ocean was thought of as capable of offense, as something that could listen, remember, and retaliate. The Kraken was simply the visible reminder of that belief, the hand that reached up when the sea decided to collect its due. In this way, the monster and the sea were inseparable. The Kraken was not an intruder in the ocean. It was the ocean in another form. To tell a story about one was to tell a story about the other. This is why the legend persisted, even when the details shifted, when drawings changed from whale-like backs to squid-like arms. The essence remained the same. The sea is alive, and it shows its will through beings too vast to comprehend. When we consider the old maps, the sagas, and the sailors' tales together, we see that the Kraken is not just folklore. It is a worldview in motion, a way of making sense of an environment that was both life-giving and life-taking. The sea was never empty, never background. It was a character that could not be ignored, and the Kraken was its most memorable mask. And as stories of this living ocean spread, they laid the groundwork for the next step. If the sea was a character, then its monsters were not just threats. They were images of meaning, symbols that carried lessons about survival, hubris, and fate. The tentacles that rose from the waves were more than arms. They were warnings, embodiments of forces that tested those who crossed the deep. The image that survived longest from all the scattered accounts of the Kraken is not the island-like back or the gaping mouth said to swallow ships whole. It is the tentacle. Long, boneless arms coiling upward from the sea, wrapping themselves around masts, pulling men from decks, crushing hulls into splinters. This picture became the symbol of the monster and the reason it endured long after many other sea legends faded. The tentacle was not just another detail in the stories, it was the perfect embodiment of what the ocean meant to sailors: unseen danger rising without warning, inescapable, flexible, and alive. In the earliest descriptions, the Kraken was sometimes imagined more like a whale or a fish, vast enough to be mistaken for land. But as more sightings of giant squid carcasses appeared on beaches, and as sailors spoke of arms trailing in the water, the idea of the Kraken with tentacles took hold. The change was inevitable. Whales were already known, their size and strength acknowledged, but they could still be hunted, still be understood. Tentacles, on the other hand, belonged to something alien. They moved differently than fins or tails. They did not strike once and withdraw. They wrapped, twisted, and pulled. The sight of an arm as thick as a tree rising silently from the depths suggested not just size, but intention. A tentacle did not need to roar or thrash to terrify. Its slow curl was enough. The psychology of this fear runs deep. Humans are primates, creatures evolved in environments where danger usually came from fangs or claws. The grasping limb, flexible and boneless, belongs to no predator we are naturally equipped to face. When sailors saw an arm break the surface, covered in strange suckers that looked like eyes or mouths, it triggered a sense of dread that claws or teeth could not. It was unfamiliar, uncanny. A tentacle was not a weapon designed to kill quickly, but one meant to entangle and suffocate. That was why it lingered in memory more than any other part of the Kraken legend. The tentacle also symbolized inevitability. A ship caught in a storm might survive with luck or skill. A whale might ram a vessel, but could be driven off. A reef might tear a hull, but only if the sailors failed to avoid it. A tentacle rising from the deep, however, suggested there was no escape. It could strike from any angle at any time, dragging its prey down with silent certainty. To sailors who spent months in fragile wooden craft, constantly at the mercy of currents and winds, that image resonated. It was not just about monsters, it was about the feeling of being trapped by forces too large to resist. Illustrations from the 17th and 18th centuries fixed this image in the cultural imagination. Artists who had never been to sea sketched engravings of ships under siege by massive arms, each one wrapping around masts, snapping sails and crushing hulls. The faces of sailors were drawn in frozen terror, tiny against the scale of the limbs. These pictures were not scientific records. They were dramatizations, meant to capture the essence of the stories. But they worked. Once people saw the Kraken in these terms, as a many-armed terror, the older descriptions of whale-like bodies faded. The monster became synonymous with tentacles. There was another reason this image endured. It reflected the hidden nature of the sea itself. Tentacles rarely showed the whole creature. A sailor might see only one or two arms rising, with the body invisible beneath the surface. This partial glimpse mirrored the way the ocean revealed itself, never in full, always in fragments. A wave here, a shadow there, a sound carried through the hull. The Kraken's tentacles symbolized that fragmentary knowledge, the sense that what you saw was only part of something larger, something waiting just out of sight. The endurance of the tentacle also speaks to the way humans tell stories. A monster must have a defining trait, something that makes it instantly recognizable. The Cyclops has its single eye, the dragon has wings and fire, the werewolf has its transformation. The Kraken found its mark in the tentacle. It was the detail that could be drawn, described, and feared with clarity, even when the rest of the creature remained vague. Its size, its shape, its mouth. The tentacle was unmistakable. It was the hook that fixed the legend in memory. But beyond memory, the tentacle carried symbolic weight. It was the perfect metaphor for entrapment. It represented the experience of being seized by something larger than oneself, wrapped in coils of obligation, greed, or fear. Sailors did not need philosophy to understand this. To be caught in a storm, in debt, in battle, all felt like being held fast by arms you could not escape. The Kraken's tentacles gave that feeling a visible form. That is why the image traveled so easily from sailors' tales to popular imagination. Anyone, even someone who had never seen the ocean, could understand the terror of being seized and dragged down. This imagery also fed into moral lessons. Just as the Kraken's presence lured fish to the surface, tempting sailors to take more than they should, the tentacle represented the price of excess. Those who lingered too long at sea, driven by greed, were wrapped up and destroyed. The monster punished arrogance not with a single blow, but with a slow, inevitable constriction. It was not a quick death, but a drawn-out one, mirroring the consequences of ignoring caution. The tentacle was as much a warning as a horror. In popular retellings, the tentacle became exaggerated to impossible scales. Writers spoke of arms a mile long, able to reach across entire ships. Maps showed beasts so large that their coils encircled whole fleets. The exaggeration mattered less than the image itself. The Kraken was not about realism. It was about scale, about making the sea's hidden power visible. The more the arms grew in size, the more they conveyed the true subject of the story, the immeasurable, suffocating might of the ocean. This explains why the tentacle endured even when science began to strip away other elements of the myth. By the 19th century, naturalists identified the giant squid as a real animal, capable of reaching extraordinary lengths. Sightings of their carcasses washed ashore confirmed that arms with suckers the size of coins did exist. These discoveries gave the tentacle credibility, grounding it in biology. Even as the Kraken shifted from legend to zoology, the tentacle survived as the bridge between the two. A monster that had once been pure myth now had a foothold in reality, and the image of its arms remained as powerful as ever. Literature cemented this endurance. Writers like Jules Verne made the giant squid famous in works such as 20,000 Leagues Under the Seas, describing battles between submarines and monstrous arms that wrapped around hulls with crushing force. These stories did not claim to be folklore. They were fiction, but they borrowed the same imagery. The tentacle became not only a symbol of old sailors' fears, but a motif in modern storytelling. It represented the alien, the unknown, the unstoppable. In every medium, from engravings to novels to film, it was the tentacle that endured, not the vague bulk or the unseen mouth. The visual power of this image explains why it still resonates today. A single arm breaking the surface of the water remains one of the most striking ways to signal danger. It is instantly recognizable, instantly evocative. Modern films, video games, and artwork return to it again and again. The tentacle is now shorthand for the unknown lurking beneath. It speaks to the same fear sailors felt centuries ago, that something immense and deliberate is reaching up from below, ready to take hold. The persistence of this image shows how myths survive not because they are accurate, but because they capture truths about human experience. The tentacle is not feared because of biology. It is feared because it embodies the feeling of being trapped, of facing a power that is flexible, patient, and inescapable. That feeling is timeless, and so the image endures. The Kraken's tentacles became the defining symbol of the monster, not only because they were strange, but because they fit so perfectly with the way the ocean was understood. The sea grasped at ships, pulled men under, tangled nets, and swallowed whole fleets. To give that grasp a visible form was to turn the sea itself into a hand. And once that hand had been imagined, it was impossible to forget. As the legend spread beyond the north, this image of the tentacled monster became universal. It could be adapted into different cultures, retold in different contexts, but the core remained. The arms rising from the sea did not belong only to Norway or Iceland. They belonged to the human imagination, to anyone who had ever looked at the water and wondered what lay beneath. And that is why, centuries after the first stories, the Kraken's tentacles still reach into our minds as easily as they once reached for the masts of ships. And with that image fixed in imagination, the monster became more than a threat. It became a trial, a test of human endurance and humility. To face the tentacles was not only to risk death, but to prove worth. The next stage of the legend shows how the Kraken, like other mythical forces, became woven into stories of initiation, challenge, and survival. The arms were not just instruments of destruction. They were symbols of the trials every sailor and every human must endure when confronting the unknown. For the men who first spread tales of the Kraken, the monster was never just another hazard to be feared. It was a trial, a test of whether they had the courage, patience, and humility to survive the sea. Life aboard a ship was already an ordeal. The cold gnawed constantly at the body, food spoiled quickly in damp holds, and storms could break masts or tear sails in minutes. Sleep was brief and shallow, broken by the constant need to manage ropes, pumps, and watch shifts. Every day was a reminder of how fragile a human life was against the ocean. Against that backdrop, the Kraken was not simply a legend to pass the time. It was the ultimate version of what they endured. It was the sea itself, given a face and arms, testing whether they were fit to remain upon its surface. The idea of the monster as a trial can be seen in the way its stories were told. It did not always appear as an aggressor striking without cause. More often, it emerged when men made mistakes, when they lingered too long over the bounty of fish it attracted, or when they mistook its back for land and grew careless. This reflected a truth sailors already knew, that the ocean punished arrogance. Those who ignored its signs, who forgot to keep watch, who disrespected its power, did not return. The Kraken was simply the dramatic embodiment of that principle. It was the sea's judgment, rising in flesh to remind men of their limits. The daily life of mariners prepared them for such trials. They were constantly tested by conditions that demanded endurance. Long voyages forced them to ration food and water, to endure sickness without medicine, and to face the fear of being lost with no land in sight. Each task on a ship was a miniature trial. Hauling nets heavy with catch, climbing rigging slick with ice, or steering through fog all carried the risk of death. To succeed was to prove oneself capable of facing forces beyond control. The Kraken,
was the narrative mirror of those daily ordeals. Just as sailors wrestled ropes, they imagined wrestling tentacles. Just as they survived storms, they imagined surviving a monster's grip. Stories of encounters often emphasized the choices men made. Some crews fled at the first sign of disturbance, raising sails and praying to outrun what they thought was rising beneath them. Others stood firm, cutting ropes to free their ships from anchors or nets that threatened to drag them down. The Kraken legend amplified these choices into moral tests. To respect the danger and act quickly was to pass. To hesitate, to overreach, or to let greed dictate decisions was to fail. In this way, the monster was not just about fear, it was about judgment. The test was also collective. A ship was not a solitary individual but a small society afloat. Success or failure depended on the crew's ability to work together under strain. The Kraken embodied the ultimate pressure on that unity.
If tentacles rose from the water, men had to act in concert, to cut, to row, to hold steady. Panic could be as deadly as the monster itself. Tales of survival often praised the discipline of the crew, while tales of destruction spoke of fear that spread too quickly. In that sense, the Kraken tested not just individuals, but entire communities. It revealed whether they could hold together in the face of the unknown. The monster also reflected the larger trial of venturing into uncharted waters. Every voyage carried the possibility of discovery, but also the risk of never returning. Maps of the time were filled with blank spaces marked by sea monsters, warnings that the farther one went, the more one risked. To sail into those spaces was to accept a trial willingly, to test one's courage against forces no one could predict. The Kraken was the natural symbol for that leap into uncertainty. It was the unknown made visible, the trial that awaited anyone bold enough to push beyond the familiar. For many, faith was the only shield against that uncertainty. Prayers were spoken before voyages, offerings made before sails were raised. When storms struck or shadows appeared in the water, men called upon saints or Christ himself for protection. The Kraken was often framed within that religious worldview as a test of faith. To survive its appearance was proof of divine favor. To fall victim to it was a warning about sin, greed, or pride. The monster was not just a natural force, it was a moral force, a trial set by God through the sea to measure the hearts of men. The endurance required to face such trials shaped the culture of sailors. Hardship was expected, and stories of the Kraken were part of that preparation. By imagining the worst possible trial, the sea itself rising in monstrous form, sailors steeled themselves for lesser ones. If they could picture surviving the Kraken, they could picture surviving storms, starvation, or mutiny. The legend was not just entertainment, it was training, a way of building mental resilience against the constant trials of the sea. The image of the Kraken as a trial also explains why it endured in folklore. Unlike many monsters that appear once in myth and vanish, the Kraken was always there, always waiting. Every voyage into dangerous waters carried the possibility of encountering it. Every decision about how much fish to take, how far to sail, or when to return was a reenactment of its test. In that sense, the Kraken was not confined to single stories. It was part of the ongoing experience of being a mariner. It lived in the choices men made, the risks they took, and the trials they endured. Accounts of sailors who claimed to survive encounters often ended with a sense of transformation. They returned home not simply as men who had seen something strange, but as men who had been tested and survived. To face the Kraken was to undergo a rite of passage, to come back with new authority, new respect, and new fear. In this way, the monster was woven into the life cycle of seafaring. It marked the transition from novice to veteran, from boy to man, from sailor to survivor. Even when later generations dismissed the monster as myth, the idea of the sea as a place of trial remained. Modern ships with steel hulls and engines still face storms, isolation, and the unknown. The Kraken may no longer be feared as a literal threat, but its symbolic role endures. The ocean is still a place where men are tested, where their strength, skill, and will are measured against forces beyond control. The Kraken was simply the most vivid way of expressing that truth, the monster that made the trial visible. And so, the legend of the Kraken as a sailor's trial persisted not because it described a real creature, but because it described a real experience. Life at sea was and remains an unending sequence of tests, each one demanding courage, restraint, and unity. The tentacles that rose from the water were not just arms of a beast. They were the arms of the sea itself, reaching out to measure whether those who sailed upon it were worthy to remain. With this understanding, the Kraken became more than a monster of rumor. It became a fixture of maps, natural histories, and sermons, a symbol of the trial that awaited anyone who dared to cross the waves. The sea was not empty, and neither were its stories. In the next stage, the Kraken moved from oral tradition into ink, drawn into charts and books that tried to fix its shifting form on the page. The trial was no longer told only among sailors. It was recorded for all to see. When stories of the Kraken passed from the mouths of sailors into the hands of mapmakers, something profound happened. The monster that had lived in rumor and memory became part of the physical world. It was no longer only in the minds of men at sea. It was drawn in ink, labeled and placed upon charts meant to guide real voyages. This transformation reveals how early cartography was never just about measurement and direction. It was about imagination. Maps were not only tools for navigation, they were also canvases for myth, recording both what was known and what was feared. The oceans of the medieval and early modern world were filled with uncertainty. Large parts of the globe had yet to be explored by Europeans, and even well-traveled waters held dangers that could not be predicted. To represent that uncertainty, mapmakers filled their margins with illustrations of monsters, whales the size of islands, serpents coiled around ships, and giant fish with human faces appeared beside coastlines and across the blank spaces of uncharted seas. These images were not decorative flourishes. They were warnings, symbolic placeholders for the dangers that waited in waters no one fully understood. Among these figures, the Kraken soon took its place. One of the earliest cartographic traditions to feature the monster came from Scandinavia. In the 16th century, Olaus Magnus, a Swedish cartographer and clergyman, published his great work, the Carta Marina. This enormous map of the northern seas was filled with creatures, each representing stories gathered from sailors and fishermen. In its waters, whales blow fountains high into the air, sea serpents twist their coils around terrified crews, and strange hybrid beasts leap from the waves. Near Iceland and Norway, where the Kraken was said to dwell, Magnus placed images of monstrous fish and cephalopods. Though he did not always use the name Kraken, the essence was there. Creatures that could swallow men, overturn ships, or lure fishermen to destruction. These maps served a double purpose. For those who sailed, they reinforced what was already believed, that the sea was not empty but inhabited. For those who never left the land, they offered a vision of distant waters filled with marvels and terrors. To a merchant in Venice or a scholar in Paris, the Kraken was as real as the whale or the walrus, because it appeared in the same space, drawn with the same pen. Myth and reality were not separated. They were layered on the same page. As cartography advanced, the Kraken continued to appear, sometimes as a distinct cephalopod, sometimes as the ambiguous Hafgufa. Its depiction shifted depending on the artist. In some maps, it was a fish with gaping jaws, large enough to swallow a ship whole. In others, it was drawn with long, curling arms, each one wrapping around a vessel. These images reflected the diversity of the oral tales, but they also helped standardize the monster's form. Once a picture was printed, it carried authority, fixing details that had once been fluid. The tentacled kraken in one engraving became the kraken in the minds of all who saw it, reinforcing the image across generations. The placement of these monsters on maps was telling. They were often drawn at the edges, in places less well known where geography faded into speculation. The kraken was not usually sketched in the middle of well-travelled trade routes, but in the northern reaches, near Iceland and Greenland, where few outsiders sailed and where stories of vast creatures were most common. In this way, the monster marked the boundary between the known and the unknown. To sail toward its image was to cross into waters where ordinary rules no longer applied. The blending of myth and map was not only visual. Natural histories of the time also treated the kraken as a subject worth recording. Writers such as the Norwegian bishop Erik Pontoppidan in the 18th century devoted pages to the monster, describing it as the largest creature in the ocean, a being so vast it could be mistaken for an island. Pontoppidan insisted he had gathered reliable testimony from sailors and fishermen. He even claimed the creature was responsible for whirlpools that swallowed ships. By setting these accounts alongside descriptions of real animals, he gave the kraken a kind of scientific weight. For readers who never saw the sea, there was little reason to doubt him. The kraken was written with the same authority as whales or sharks. This mixture of observation and imagination reflected the nature of knowledge in that era. The boundaries between fact and myth were porous. Scholars did not separate folklore from zoology in the way modern science does. Instead, they collected everything, trusting that truth would emerge from the accumulation of accounts. If many men swore they had seen the kraken, then it belonged in the record. The absence of a captured specimen did not disprove its existence. The sea was vast and largely unexplored. Who could say what lived in its depths? In this way, the kraken became part of a larger European tradition of monstrous geography. Just as the edges of old maps showed men with dog heads or nations of giants, so too did the oceans hold creatures that blurred the line between reality and legend. The kraken was not an embarrassment in this context. It was expected. To leave the northern seas empty on a map would have seemed stranger than to fill them with monsters. The visual power of these cartographic depictions cannot be overstated. A story told in a tavern might fade, its details shifting with each retelling. A story fixed in ink on a map endured. Generations of readers, sailors, and scholars saw the same coiling arms, the same ships crushed in their grip. The image carried authority simply because it was printed. The kraken thus transitioned from an oral legend into a cultural fixture anchored in geography itself. Even as maps grew more precise and exploration expanded, the monster did not vanish. Instead, it adapted. In some 18th and 19th century works, the kraken was described less as a supernatural being and more as a natural wonder. Writers speculated it might be a giant squid or an unknown species of whale or a crustacean of impossible size. The tone shifted from myth to science, but the fascination remained. The kraken had become a subject of inquiry, a puzzle to be solved, rather than a fable to be dismissed. This transition reveals something important about how myths survive. The kraken endured not because it was consistently believed in the same way, but because it was flexible. On maps, it was a monster to be feared. In natural histories, it was a mystery to be studied. In taverns, it was a test of sailors' courage. The form shifted, but the essence remained. The monster always marked the point where knowledge ended and imagination began. The presence of the kraken on maps also speaks to the relationship between exploration and fear. Every new voyage carried the promise of discovery, but also the threat of the unknown. To draw a monster at the edge of a chart was to acknowledge that danger. It was both a warning and an invitation. For some, it deterred. For others, it tempted. The Kraken was a symbol of risk, but also of the rewards that might lie beyond it. To sail past its image was to step into a larger world. The endurance of the Kraken in cartography reflects the human need to make sense of uncertainty. The sea could not be left blank. It had to be filled, even if only with the shapes of monsters. To those who drew the maps, the Kraken was not an error, but a solution, a way of giving form to what could not yet be explained. It was less about describing a literal animal than about capturing the feeling of the unknown, vast, dangerous, and alive. Over time, as navigation improved and blank spaces on maps disappeared, the monsters faded. The seas were no longer filled with illustrations of serpents and whales, but with lines of latitude and longitude, roots and soundings. Yet the Kraken did not vanish entirely. By then, it had already passed into literature, into art, into the imagination of people who no longer needed maps to believe in it. The ink had done its work. The monster had been fixed in cultural memory, and no amount of precision could erase it. And so, between myth and map, the Kraken found its place. It was drawn where the sea was least understood, recorded in books where fact and folklore mingled, and believed in because it represented more than a creature. It represented the boundary of knowledge, the place where human understanding ended and the ocean began. And from that place, it would continue to shape how people thought about the sea, not only as a physical space, but as a moral one, where monsters could serve as warnings, punishments, and reminders of forces beyond control. From the margins of maps and the pages of natural histories, the Kraken carried its influence into the sermons and teachings of the Church, where it became more than a symbol of geography. It became a moral lesson, a sign of temptation and judgment, drawn not only on the ocean's surface but on the souls of men. When the Kraken moved from sailors' tales and map margins into the moral language of the Church, it underwent another transformation. It was no longer just a monster of the deep or a warning drawn for navigators. It became a lesson, a symbol of sin, temptation, and divine judgment. For centuries, the Church provided the framework through which people understood not only their souls, but also the natural world. Animals, storms, and landscapes were all interpreted as signs of God's will. The sea was no exception. Its monsters were not only creatures of flesh, but symbols of moral truth, reminders of the dangers that awaited those who strayed from faith. The Kraken fit this worldview perfectly. Medieval sermons often drew upon the imagery of the ocean to describe the struggle of life. The faithful were likened to ships sailing through stormy waters, with the Church as the safe harbour and Christ as the captain. In that allegory, the dangers of the sea became metaphors for sin. Storms represented wrath, reefs represented hidden temptations, and monsters represented the forces of evil, seeking to drag souls into the abyss. When preachers needed vivid images to impress their congregations, the Kraken was ready at hand. A creature vast enough to swallow ships became an image of sin large enough to consume entire communities. Tentacles that wrapped and pulled became symbols of greed, lust, or pride ensnaring the unwary. One of the details preserved in northern lore, that the Kraken lured fish in great numbers to its body, lent itself especially well to moral lessons. Priests pointed to this as an image of temptation. The sea appeared to offer abundance, but hidden beneath was destruction. To take more than one needed, to linger too long over the catch, was to risk being swallowed whole. In this way, the Kraken became an allegory for greed. The devil, like the monster, lured men with apparent blessings, only to drag them down when they grew careless. The story, retold from pulpits and moral texts, became a warning about the dangers of forgetting moderation. The ambiguity of the Kraken's behavior also served moral teaching. Some accounts described it as indifferent, rising and sinking, with no regard for humans. Others described it as actively hostile, dragging men to their deaths. Preachers used both versions. The indifferent Kraken represented the randomness of death, reminding the faithful that life could end at any moment and that salvation could not be delayed. The hostile Kraken represented the devil's pursuit of souls, a predator stalking those who wandered from the safety of the church. Both interpretations reinforced the same lesson. Vigilance and faith were the only defenses against the dangers of the world. The association between the Kraken and whirlpools also carried symbolic weight. Sailors often spoke of the sea opening in sudden spirals, dragging ships downward. In moral teaching, this became a metaphor for sin's pull. To fall into temptation was not a slow decline, but a sudden descent, a spiral that quickened until escape was impossible. The Kraken, said to cause these whirlpools by its sheer movement, embodied that danger. It was not only the physical sea that could drown men, but the sea of desire and corruption. The image of a ship sucked into a vortex became a warning to congregations about the speed with which sin could destroy. Natural historians who recorded tales of the Kraken often did so in the language of marvels, treating it as one of God's wonders. They saw no contradiction between science and faith, for to describe the monster was to describe part of creation. But moralists emphasized the lesson rather than the biology. To them, the Kraken was not a zoological puzzle, but a mirror for the human soul. The vastness of its body reflected the vastness of sin. The inescapability of its arms reflected the binding power of vice. Its rarity reflected the unpredictability of temptation, appearing suddenly when least expected. In all these ways, the monster served as a sermon without words. The Church's adoption of the Kraken also reveals how folklore could be absorbed into official teaching. Stories told in taverns or on ships gained authority when they were repeated from pulpits. Once they became part of the moral imagination, they could no longer be dismissed as idle tales. They were seen as allegories of eternal truth. The Kraken thus gained a kind of immortality, not just in sailors' memory, but in the moral universe of Christianity. There are records of preachers who compared the Kraken to Leviathan, the sea beast described in the Bible. Leviathan, in the book of Job, is a symbol of chaos, a creature no man can tame, a terror that only God can control. By linking the Kraken to this biblical monster, priests gave it scriptural weight. It was no longer just a northern rumor, it was a reflection of chaos itself, part of the same cosmic struggle described in sacred text. The connection allowed the legend to travel beyond the north, into the imagination of Christians across Europe who had never heard the original sagas. The moral lessons drawn from the Kraken also spoke to the realities of seafaring life. Sailors were often regarded with suspicion by settled communities. They lived on the edge of society, exposed to foreign cultures, prone to drinking and gambling when ashore. To preach about the Kraken as a symbol of sin at sea reinforced the idea that sailors needed guidance, that their world was fraught with dangers not only physical, but spiritual. The monster was used as a warning not just to them, but to those on land as well, who could see in its story a reflection of their own temptations. What is striking is how naturally the legend fit into this moral framework. It did not need to be reshaped to serve as allegory. Its elements, the lure of fish, the sudden whirlpool, the inescapable arms, were already rich in symbolic meaning. The Church simply amplified what was already present in the tales. This is why the Kraken endured even as other folklore faded. It carried moral weight, and so it was preserved not only in maps and books, but in sermons and teachings that shaped daily life. Even as the Enlightenment began to challenge older ways of thinking, the moral dimension of the Kraken persisted. Naturalists could debate whether it was a giant squid or a misunderstood whale, but preachers continued to use it as a symbol of sin and temptation. The monster's role as a moral lesson did not require it to exist in flesh. It needed only to exist in the imagination as a vivid reminder of the dangers of greed, pride, and neglect. This moral reading also laid the groundwork for later interpretations. When science sought to explain the legend through biology, the symbolic meaning did not vanish. Instead, it merged. The discovery of real giant squids with arms capable of gripping whales did not erase the allegory of temptation. If anything, it reinforced it. The real existence of tentacled giants made the metaphor even more powerful. The Kraken was not only possible, it was true in both body and meaning. The Church's embrace of the Kraken ensured that the monster was never confined to the sea alone. It became a lesson carried into daily life, a reminder that temptation could appear anywhere, sudden and vast, ready to drag one down. To speak of the Kraken was to speak of the struggle every Christian faced, whether sailor or farmer, merchant or monk. Its image lingered not only on maps, but in hearts, shaping how people saw the dangers around them. And as science began to rise, probing the depths of the ocean and searching for natural explanations, the Kraken did not retreat. It shifted again, from moral allegory into scientific puzzle, from sermon to specimen. Yet even in that transformation, the moral weight remained, echoing in the background as the monster moved into the realm of natural philosophy and biology. The sea still held trials, but now men sought to explain them with reason, not only with faith. When the Kraken moved from sermons and sagas into the language of natural philosophy, it underwent yet another transformation. No longer framed solely as a moral allegory or a cartographic symbol, it became a question for science. Could such a creature exist? If so, what was it? The Enlightenment and the centuries that followed were marked by a growing confidence in human reason. Scholars believed that by collecting observations, comparing reports and classifying animals, they could unravel the mysteries of the natural world. The Kraken, long a figure of rumor, was not exempt from this process. It entered the realm of scientific speculation, half dismissed and half believed, a puzzle that demanded explanation. The Norwegian bishop Erik Pontoppidan played a central role in this shift. In the 18th century, he wrote his Natural History of Norway, a sprawling work that sought to record the animals, plants, and phenomena of his homeland. Among descriptions of whales and fish, he included a detailed account of the Kraken. He did not treat it as a myth, he treated it as a fact, describing it as the largest living creature in the sea. Pontoppidan insisted it was not a singular being, but a species, perhaps rare, but certainly real. He described its size as so vast that when it surfaced, sailors mistook it for an island. He wrote of its ability to create whirlpools when it sank, and of the way it drew fish to its body in swarms. These were not casual mentions. They were presented with the same seriousness as his descriptions of cod or whales. Pontoppidan's work illustrates the transitional nature of knowledge in his time. He stood between folklore and science, between oral tradition and empirical method. He gathered testimonies from sailors, fishermen, and coastal residents, compiling them into what he believed was reliable evidence. His willingness to treat the Kraken seriously reflected both the persistence of belief in the monster and the openness of natural history to incorporate wonder. In an era before photography, specimens, and widespread exploration of the deep, testimony carried weight. To discount the reports of numerous seamen would have seemed arrogant. If so many had seen the Kraken, why should it not be real? Pontoppidan's description did not go unchallenged. Other scholars doubted the existence of such a creature, arguing that the reports could be explained by known animals. Some suggested whales, whose massive bodies and spouts could be mistaken for islands or monsters in poor weather. Others pointed to schools of fish or masses of jellyfish, which could create illusions of great size. Still others speculated about volcanic activity, bubbles, or floating vegetation. Yet the fact that they debated at all shows how seriously the question was taken. The Kraken was not dismissed outright. It was considered a phenomenon in need of explanation. This period marked the beginning of a broader shift in how the sea was understood. For centuries, it had been a domain of mystery, filled with creatures of imagination. Now naturalists sought to catalogue it, to place each marvel within the framework of taxonomy. Yet the ocean resisted this effort. Unlike the land, it could not be easily observed. Its depths remained inaccessible, its creatures elusive. Sailors might see only glimpses, carcasses washed ashore, or strange remains dredged from nets. Out of these fragments, naturalists tried to reconstruct reality. The Kraken fit perfectly into this uncertainty. It was too consistent a legend to dismiss, yet too elusive to confirm. As exploration expanded, reports of strange creatures multiplied. Whales with scars from colossal battles, enormous tentacles washed onto beaches, and mysterious remains found floating at sea all fed the speculation. Some naturalists began to argue that the Kraken might indeed be a giant cephalopod, an immense squid unlike anything commonly known. Squids were already familiar, but their larger relatives remained largely unseen. If smaller squids existed, why not larger ones? The idea gained traction as more evidence appeared. Yet for every scholar who entertained the Kraken as plausible, there were others who mocked it. Satirical pamphlets circulated, ridiculing Pontoppidan's descriptions.
Caricatures of giant crabs, fish with wings, and monsters devouring ships were published to lampoon the credulity of those who believed in such things. To skeptics, the Kraken was proof not of a real creature, but of human folly, the tendency to exaggerate what one does not understand. But the ridicule did not erase the reports. Sailors continued to speak of strange shapes in the water, of tentacles brushing against hulls, of carcasses too large to identify. The debate over the Kraken reflects the larger tension of the age, the clash between wonder and reason. Enlightenment thinkers prided themselves on dispelling superstition, yet they remained fascinated by the possibility of marvels. The Kraken sat at this crossroads. It was too rich a legend to ignore, too widely reported to dismiss, yet too extraordinary to confirm. It hovered in the space between belief and doubt, serving as a reminder that the sea still resisted full explanation. What gave the legend longevity in this new context was the growing sense of the ocean's depth as a frontier. The word abyss gained resonance, referring not only to theological mystery, but to physical space. The deep sea was imagined as a world within a world, dark and unexplored, holding forms of life yet to be discovered. The Kraken became a placeholder for that abyss. It was not only a monster, it was the embodiment of the unknown that lay beneath the surface. To speak of it was to acknowledge that the ocean still contained secrets beyond imagination. As the 19th century progressed, evidence for giant squids became stronger. Fishermen brought back carcasses with arms long enough to span the deck of a ship. Whales were found with sucker marks on their skin, scars from battles with unseen foes. Reports of enormous tentacles washed ashore in Newfoundland, Iceland, and New Zealand circulated widely. Each discovery gave new life to the idea that the Kraken might have a real biological counterpart. The line between myth and science blurred further. What had once been dismissed as sailors' fantasy now seemed possible in light of physical evidence. But even as giant squids emerged as the likely explanation, the Kraken retained its symbolic weight. Scientists might explain the arms, the size, and the behavior, but they could not explain away the fear. The monster was more than a zoological curiosity. It represented the ocean itself, the abyss that resisted human mastery.
The tentacles remained a symbol of entrapment, the whirlpools a symbol of sudden doom. Science could identify the animal, but it could not strip the legend of its meaning. The Kraken's entry into natural history thus did not destroy the myth, it transformed it. The monster became part of scientific debate, an example of how folklore could contain a kernel of truth. Sailors may have exaggerated, but they had not invented from nothing.
Their stories preserved fragments of real encounters with creatures the world had not yet classified. In this sense, the Kraken was vindicated, not disproven. It shifted from myth to misunderstood reality, from impossibility to mystery awaiting further study. This transformation also reveals the persistence of human awe. Even when scholars offered rational explanations, the sense of wonder did not fade. The deep sea remained a place of imagination, a realm where monsters could still hide. The Kraken, whether myth or squid, continued to symbolize that possibility. It endured because it spoke not only to what was known, but to what was not yet known, and perhaps could never be fully known. By the time marine biology advanced in the 19th and 20th centuries, the Kraken had already secured its place in both science and culture. The discovery of Architeuthis, the giant squid, seemed to confirm what sailors had long said, that immense tentacled creatures did indeed exist. The myth had been grounded in reality, yet reality did not diminish the myth. Instead, the two merged. The Kraken was no longer only a monster of rumor. It was a symbol of the abyss itself, the place where science and wonder met. And from that abyss the legend would continue, carried forward not only by scientists but by poets, writers, and artists who saw in the giant squid a living echo of the monster that had haunted maps, sermons, and sagas.
The Kraken had moved through every stage of human imagination, myth, moral, science, and at each stage it gained new life. Its next transformation would come through the living specimens of the giant squid, proof that some parts of the legend were not fantasy at all, but flesh. When the first stories of the Kraken spread through the north, few could have guessed that they were not entirely inventions, exaggerated, reshaped, and layered with meaning, yes, but not baseless. In the deep sea, beyond the reach of sunlight, there were indeed creatures with arms long enough to wrap around ships and eyes the size of shields. The discovery of the giant squid gave flesh to the old tales, proving that behind the monster's shadow was a real animal of astonishing proportions. The biology of Architeuthis, as it came to be called, is one of the clearest examples of how myth and reality intertwine, each sustaining the other across centuries. The existence of squid was never in doubt. Fishermen had long known of smaller species, their bodies hauled up in nets or found in shallow waters. They were familiar, edible, and unremarkable compared to the whales and sharks that dominated the imagination. But rumors persisted of squid far larger than any commonly seen, creatures that rarely surfaced, whose remains sometimes washed ashore in grotesque fragments. These remains were the first real clues that the Kraken might not be entirely fanciful. Tentacles with suckers the size of coins, beaks larger than a man's hand, and carcasses measuring many meters in length appeared sporadically on beaches from Iceland to Newfoundland. Each discovery reignited speculation. If such fragments existed, what must the living creature look like? The giant squid remained elusive for centuries because of its habitat. It dwells in the deep, far below the surface, where sunlight does not penetrate and human eyes cannot follow. Unlike whales, which surface to breathe, squids have no reason to break the waves unless injured or dying. Most evidence of them came second-hand, in the form of remains floating at sea or vomited up by sperm whales. These fragments were often in poor condition, partially digested or rotting, which only added to their strangeness. A fisherman finding such a piece could be forgiven for imagining a monster beyond comprehension. One of the earliest well-documented encounters with giant squid remains came in the 17th century, when Danish naturalist Ole Worm received reports of a massive beak and arms found on a beach. He concluded it must belong to a sea creature of extraordinary size, though he could not classify it. Similar reports surfaced across the Atlantic world in the centuries that followed. Each time, they were met with both fascination and skepticism. Without a living specimen, scholars could only guess, yet the consistency of the remains, always with the same distinctive beaks and sucker-lined arms, built a case that something real lurked beneath the surface. The true scale of these animals became clearer in the 19th century, when more complete carcasses began to appear. In 1857, Danish naturalist Japetus Steenstrup studied large squid remains found in Denmark and Newfoundland, and he gave the species its scientific name, Architeuthis dux, meaning ruling squid. Steenstrup argued that these creatures were the basis of the Kraken legend, and his careful study lent scientific legitimacy to the idea. What had once been sailors' rumour was now anchored in taxonomy, placed within the growing system of biological classification. The physical characteristics of the giant squid are astonishing even today. Adults can reach lengths of over 40 feet, with some reports suggesting even larger specimens. Their eyes, among the largest in the animal kingdom, measure nearly a foot across, evolved to detect the faintest traces of light in the deep. Their arms and tentacles are lined with powerful suckers, some with serrated rings of chitin that leave circular scars on the bodies of their prey, and on the skin of sperm whales, their primary predator. Their bodies are soft and boneless, allowing them to move with flexibility and to withstand the immense pressures of the deep. For sailors encountering pieces of such creatures, the leap to a monster like the Kraken was not so far-fetched. The battles between giant squids and sperm whales became another source of fascination. Whales have been found with scars from enormous suckers, evidence of violent struggles in the dark below. To imagine such a fight, an animal the size of a bus grappling with a whale the size of a house, was to glimpse a drama worthy of myth. If the squid could resist the whale, why not imagine it resisting a ship? To sailors who saw the aftermath on whale flesh, or who hauled up giant arms in their nets, the Kraken seemed not only possible, but undeniable. Despite these discoveries, the giant squid remained elusive in life. For generations, no one had seen a living specimen in its natural habitat. They were creatures of the abyss, revealed only in death. Carcasses washed ashore in New Zealand, Newfoundland, and Norway throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, each one confirming their existence but keeping their behavior a mystery. Scientists pieced together what they could, measuring lengths, studying beaks, and analyzing stomach contents. But the living animal remained hidden, as if determined to keep its mythic aura intact. It was only in the 21st century that the first clear images of a living giant squid were captured. In 2004, Japanese researchers managed to photograph one at a depth of nearly 3,000 feet, and in 2012, the first video footage was recorded. These images showed an animal both alien and majestic, its arms undulating as it moved through the dark. For the first time, the world saw what sailors had only imagined. The Kraken was real, not in its mythical enormity, but in a form no less wondrous. The biology of the giant squid explained many elements of the Kraken legend. Its vast size accounted for the island-like descriptions. Its long arms explained the tales of tentacles wrapping ships. Its deep habitat explained its rarity, why it was glimpsed so seldom and always in fragments. Even the whirlpools described in old accounts could be linked to the turbulence caused by such a large creature struggling at the surface. The myth was not entirely false. It was an exaggeration of real encounters with a real animal, one magnified by fear, distance, and imagination. Yet biology also highlighted the differences. Giant squids are predators of fish and smaller marine life, not destroyers of ships. Their tentacles are strong but not capable of dragging down vessels. Their immense size is impressive, but not the apocalyptic scale described in legend. The Kraken, in its mythical form, remains larger than reality. But reality is still remarkable enough to have sustained the myth for centuries. The story of the giant squid illustrates the way human beings interpret the unknown. Faced with fragments of evidence, people fill in the gaps with imagination. A single arm becomes a monster with a dozen more. A carcass becomes a beast large enough to sink ships. A scar on a whale becomes proof of battles with leviathans. In this way, the giant squid did not just inspire the Kraken legend, it also reveals how myth and science are woven together, each shaping the other.
The monster prepared people to believe in the animal, and the animal confirmed the possibility of the monster. The giant squid is not the only large cephalopod. The colossal squid, discovered in the Southern Ocean, rivals it in size and weight. With even larger hooks and thicker bodies, these creatures remind us that the ocean still harbors forms of life that remain poorly understood. Each new discovery keeps the door open for wonder. The Kraken may have been exaggerated, but the abyss still holds beings that challenge imagination. The biology behind the myth shows how stories endure, not because they are wholly false, but because they carry fragments of truth. The Kraken was never just an invention. It was a distorted memory of real encounters with giants of the deep. And when those encounters were retold, colored by fear, darkness, and the creaking timbers of a ship, they became monsters larger than life. The revelation of the giant squid did not kill the Kraken. If anything, it gave it new strength. To know that tentacled creatures 40 feet long truly exist is to realize that the line between myth and reality is thinner than we imagine. The sea remains a place where legends can be born, sustained not by fantasy alone, but by the strange alien life that truly swims beneath the waves. And as science revealed more about these creatures, the Kraken's place in the imagination shifted again.
No longer just a sailor's terror or a preacher's warning, it became part of a global catalogue of sea monsters compared with Leviathan, with serpents, with other myths of the deep. It became a symbol not only of biology but of culture, a way to link different traditions and fears into a single figure that embodied the vastness of the sea. The Kraken was not alone in the waters of myth. Across cultures and centuries, human beings told of enormous creatures rising from the deep, beings that embodied both fear and awe. These legends spoke less to zoology than to the shared experience of staring across an endless sea and wondering what might be moving just beneath the surface. Among these global kin, none loomed larger than Leviathan, the biblical sea monster whose shadow falls across Western imagination even to this day. To compare the Kraken to Leviathan and to the countless other sea monsters that filled the folklore of distant coasts is to see how universal the impulse was. Wherever there was ocean, there were stories of giants waiting in the abyss. Leviathan appears first in the Hebrew Bible, in the book of Job, where it is described as a monstrous sea creature beyond human power. Its scales are impenetrable, its breath sets coals ablaze, its heart is hard as stone. It is untamable, an image of chaos itself, one that only God can subdue. Later traditions expanded its role, sometimes imagining it as a dragon of the deep, other times as a creature destined to be slain at the end of time as part of the divine plan. Unlike the Kraken, Leviathan was cosmic in scale. It was not just a danger to sailors, it was a symbol of the forces that defy human control, a reminder that creation itself contains powers only the Creator can master. When medieval Christian writers sought to interpret the natural world through scripture, they often drew parallels between Leviathan and the sea monsters reported by sailors. The Kraken, described as vast and unstoppable, fit easily into this framework. Some preachers equated the two directly. suggesting that the stories from the north were simply local versions of the biblical beast. Others saw the Kraken as a lesser echo of Leviathan, one of many manifestations of chaos scattered across the world's oceans. Either way, the connection ensured that the Kraken was never just a Scandinavian curiosity. It belonged to a larger family of monsters, all of which spoke to the same truth. The sea is not ours. Beyond the biblical world, other cultures produced their own leviathans. In Mesopotamian myth, Tiamat was the primordial sea goddess, often envisioned as a dragon or serpent slain by the storm god Marduk in a battle that created the cosmos. Her body became the heavens and the earth, her waters the seas that surrounded them. In this myth, the sea was not only a place of chaos, but the raw material of creation. The Kraken, like Tiamat, represented the idea that the ocean was both threat and origin, destruction and source. To confront such a being was to confront the foundation of existence itself. The Greeks told of Scylla and Charybdis, monsters that guarded the narrow straits of Sicily. Scylla was a creature with multiple heads and snapping jaws, said to pluck sailors from decks.
Charybdis was a whirlpool that swallowed ships whole, a danger described in ways that echo the old stories of the Kraken's sinkings. Together they represented the perils of navigation, forces so entrenched in the geography of the sea that even Odysseus, guided by gods, could only choose between them. Their legend captures the same theme found in the Kraken. The sea does not offer safe passage without cost. In Polynesian traditions, the ocean teemed with beings both benevolent and destructive. Tales from Hawaii describe the mo'o, dragon-like water creatures that could shape-shift and control tides. In Maori lore, the taniwha guarded rivers and seas, sometimes protecting tribes, sometimes punishing them. These beings, like the Kraken, were not always purely hostile. They embodied the duality of the sea as both provider and destroyer, demanding respect in exchange for survival. To ignore their presence was to invite disaster. The Japanese told of the umibozu, a giant, shadowy figure that rose from the water during calm seas, capsizing ships without warning. Some described it as a vast head emerging from the waves, others as a black-robed priest towering above the surface. Its unpredictability mirrored the sudden violence of the ocean itself, much as the Kraken's rare but devastating appearances mirrored the same truth in the north. Even in the distant Arctic, Inuit traditions told of giant beings inhabiting the waters.
The Kalupalik was said to snatch children from shorelines, dragging them into the sea. Though smaller than the Kraken in scale, it served the same symbolic role, reminding communities that the ocean was always hungry, always capable of taking life. These diverse traditions show a common thread. No matter where people lived, when they looked at the sea, they imagined it filled with beings larger than themselves. The specific forms varied: serpents, squids, dragons, whirlpools, but the meaning was the same. The sea was a living force, and its vastness was best expressed through monsters. The Kraken was simply one of the most detailed versions of this global pattern, shaped by the particular experiences of northern sailors, but echoing the fears and insights of countless cultures. What makes the Kraken distinctive among its kin is how closely it aligns with a real animal. Leviathan, Tiamat, Scylla, and the rest were mythological in origin, their forms bearing little resemblance to any natural species. The Kraken, however, was rooted in glimpses of giant squids, in fragments of flesh and arms hauled up in nets. It was a myth born not entirely of imagination, but of encounters with real creatures too strange to fit into known categories. This gave it a longevity others lacked. When science began to probe the ocean, the Kraken could adapt. It became Architeuthis, the giant squid, and continued to thrive as both myth and reality. But in function, the Kraken shared much with its global counterparts. Like Leviathan, it embodied chaos. Like Charybdis, it swallowed ships in sudden whirlpools. Like the Umibozu, It rose without warning to destroy. Like the Taniwa, it tested whether humans respected the sea's power. Each of these monsters was a cultural mask for the same truth. The ocean is not safe, and to survive upon it requires humility. The comparisons also highlight the universality of certain images. The whirlpool, the devouring mouth, the grasping arms, all appear in different forms across different cultures. They are not simply coincidences. They reflect shared human experiences. Sailors in Norway, Japan, or Greece all watched as currents pulled their ships off course, as storms erupted without warning, as shadows moved beneath the surface. The stories they told gave those experiences a face. The Kraken was simply one of the names for that face. Leviathan's influence ensured that sea monsters were not only matters of folklore, but also of theology and philosophy. To speak of the Kraken was not only to speak of fish and waves, but of chaos and order, of human frailty before forces too vast to tame. This connection elevated the monster beyond local legend. It became part of the great chain of beings that represented the limits of human power and the vastness of creation. And in this role, the Kraken began to shift again. It was no longer only a monster to be feared, or a curiosity to be studied. It became a test, a trial through which humans measured themselves. Like Leviathan, which symbolized chaos only God could overcome, the Kraken came to embody challenges that humans could endure but not control. To face it was to prove worthiness, to demonstrate courage in the face of forces that could not be mastered. The monster's next life would be as a symbol not only of fear, but of initiation. For generations of sailors, the ocean was more than a workplace. It was a proving ground. To survive a voyage meant more than making it back alive. It meant demonstrating courage, discipline, and the ability to endure conditions that would break others. The Kraken, as it grew in legend, became the ultimate embodiment of that trial. It was not only a monster waiting in the depths, it was the ordeal itself, the great test that revealed who was worthy to sail the sea and who would be consumed by it. The stories carried this symbolism naturally. When men spoke of ships vanishing into whirlpools or of tentacles dragging vessels down, they were not only describing physical destruction, they were describing the consequences of failure, a crew that succumbed to panic, that lingered too long in greed, that ignored the warning signs of the sea. This was a crew that failed the test, and the Kraken was the name given to their punishment. By contrast, tales of survival often emphasized quick thinking, cooperation, and humility. The monster thus served as the ultimate examiner, one who rewarded discipline and punished arrogance. In the culture of sailors, rites of passage were already common. Crossing the equator for the first time, entering new waters, or completing a dangerous voyage often came with rituals that tested new crew members. These were playful at times, harsh at others, but they all reinforced the same message: to be a sailor was to endure trial. The Kraken fit into this system perfectly. It was the imagined trial beyond all others, the ordeal that dwarfed mere hazing or storm survival. To speak of it was to speak of the final exam of the sea, the one that measured a sailor's worth in the most absolute terms. The symbolism extended beyond the deck. Communities ashore who heard these stories secondhand also absorbed the lesson. The Kraken represented the danger of overreaching, of attempting more than one's skill allowed. To fishermen, it was a warning not to grow greedy when the catch was good. To traders, it was a reminder not to risk routes beyond their capacity. To villagers, it was a story that explained why some crews never returned. In each case, the monster symbolized the boundary between what was permitted and what was hubris. To cross that line was to face the Kraken's judgment. This symbolic weight explains why the monster endured even when its zoological basis was questioned. Even if it was only a myth, it still told a truth. The sea was always testing those who entered it, whether through storms, hunger, or distance from home. The Kraken gave that truth a body. Its arms and maw were the trial itself, not merely an animal, but an ordeal given form. The question was never simply whether the monster was real. The question was whether one could prove oneself against the forces it represented. In this way, the Kraken became part of a broader archetype of trial by monster. Across mythologies, heroes are tested by creatures that cannot be defeated by brute strength alone. The dragon, the serpent, the lion. Each one serves to measure the hero's worthiness. The Kraken joined this family, but with a unique maritime character. Unlike dragons guarding treasure, the Kraken guarded nothing. Its trial was not about reward, but survival. To pass the test was not to gain riches or glory, it was simply to live another day, to return home with proof that one could endure what others could not. The symbolism was reinforced by the way sailors told these stories. A man who claimed to have faced the Kraken was not only recounting a strange sight, he was declaring that he had been tested by the greatest force of the sea and had survived. His tale carried authority, marking him as one who had proven himself. Even if listeners doubted the literal details, they understood the significance. The monster was the shorthand for the ultimate ordeal, and to survive, it was to claim worth. The Kraken also reflected the larger human fascination with trials of survival. The sea was not unique in this regard. Mountains, deserts, and forests all carried their own monsters in folklore, beings that tested those who entered. But the ocean's trial was distinctive because of its scale. On land, one could hide, retreat, or find shelter. At sea, there was no escape. To be caught by the Kraken was to be utterly at the mercy of the water. The trial was total, absolute. That absoluteness gave it symbolic power far beyond other ordeals. The moral dimension of the trial also made the Kraken's symbolism powerful. It was not simply a neutral test of strength, it was a judgment of character. To survive required not only courage but restraint, cooperation, and respect for forces larger than oneself. The trial demanded humility, reminding sailors that they were not masters of the sea, but guests upon it. Those who forgot that lesson, who acted with arrogance or greed, were the ones most likely to be punished. The Kraken enforced that truth more vividly than any sermon could. This understanding of the monster as a trial resonates with broader cultural themes of initiation. Many societies framed adulthood or mastery as the ability to endure hardship and face danger. The Kraken's stories carried the same weight for sailors. To sail into waters where it might dwell was to accept the possibility of initiation, to face the trial that separated the seasoned from the untested. The monster thus became part of the cycle of life at sea, a symbolic passage into maturity. Even as science explained parts of the legend, the symbolic role persisted. A sailor in the 19th century might acknowledge that the Kraken was really a giant squid, but the language of trial remained. To speak of tentacles brushing a ship or of arms rising from the water was still to speak of being tested by the unknown. The biology could not erase the meaning. The test was still real, even if the monster was not. This symbolic dimension also explains why the Kraken continues to resonate in modern culture. Even for those who have never set foot on a ship, the idea of a monstrous trial from the deep speaks to universal fears. Everyone knows the feeling of being overwhelmed, of facing forces beyond control. The Kraken provides an image for that feeling, a way to understand the trials of life as encounters with a monster. To survive such trials is to prove worth, just as sailors once proved theirs against the sea. And so, the Kraken's meaning expanded beyond the decks of ships and the coasts of Norway. It became a universal symbol of trial, one that could apply to any situation where humans faced overwhelming forces. Its arms reached not only across the waves, but into the human imagination, where the idea of being tested by something vast and merciless has always lived. From this foundation, the next dimension of the legend unfolds. The Kraken was not only a trial imposed from without, it also represented the deepest fears within. To face it was to confront not only the sea, but the psychology of terror itself, the dread of the abyss that still grips human beings when they stare into the deep. The sea has always been more than water. For those who live by it, work on it, or cross it, it is an endless surface that conceals a second world below. Unlike forests, mountains, or deserts, where dangers can at least be seen, the ocean hides everything beneath its skin. You cannot see its floor, cannot hear its depths, cannot know what moves just beyond the reach of light. That hidden quality makes it fertile ground for fear, and in that fear, the Kraken found its home. It was not only the monster sailors claimed to glimpse in tentacles or shadows, it was the personification of a deeper psychology, a way of giving shape to the terror of the abyss. The human mind is not comfortable with the unknown. When confronted with blankness, it fills the void with images. A sailor staring down into black water imagines eyes looking back. A shadow under the ship becomes a body. A sudden swell becomes a limb. This process is not deception. It is a survival mechanism. To assume danger is to prepare for it. The Kraken grew from this instinct. It was the monster placed into the gap between what was known and what was unseen. It gave the abyss a face, however distorted, so that sailors could tell themselves they understood what threatened them. Psychologists today speak of thigmotaxis, the preference for edges and boundaries. Humans feel safer when they can see limits, when they can orient themselves against walls, horizons, or markers. The open sea offers none of these. It is endless in every direction, horizon blending into sky, depth stretching into blackness. That lack of orientation is disorienting, even maddening, and fear rises to fill it. The Kraken was the embodiment of that disorientation. It represented the terror of being lost in limitless space, where nothing could be anchored and nothing could be controlled. The fear of the deep is also a fear of scale. On land, dangers are measured against the body. A predator is larger or smaller, stronger or weaker, but always visible. At sea, scale loses meaning. A whale's bulk dwarfs a boat. A wave towers higher than masts. A current sweeps away entire crews. The Kraken took this scale and amplified it, becoming a monster that was not just larger, but immeasurable. Its body was mistaken for islands, its arms stretched beyond sight. The impossibility of its size was what made it terrifying. It represented the fear of being crushed, not by an enemy, but by the sheer disproportion between human and ocean. Another layer of psychology comes from the fear of entrapment. Tentacles, the Kraken's most enduring feature, are not weapons that kill instantly. They grasp, coil, and constrict. They represent the terror of being held against one's will, dragged into darkness with no chance of escape. Sailors who imagined such arms rising from the sea were projecting their own fear of helplessness. A storm might sink a ship, but at least one could fight the storm, steer against it, or pray for a break in the wind. A tentacle once wrapped around the hull meant the end was deliberate and inescapable. That image struck directly at the primal fear of capture. The psychology of the Kraken is also tied to isolation. At sea, men lived in small floating communities, cut off from the rest of the world for weeks or months at a time. In such isolation, the imagination magnifies every unknown. A splash in the dark becomes a threat. A shadow on the horizon becomes a monster. When fatigue, hunger, and fear combine, perception bends easily. The Kraken was not just a tale told in taverns, it was the collective hallucination of men who stared too long into the void. That hallucination endured because it expressed a truth. The sea feels inhabited even when nothing is visible. What makes the Kraken so powerful psychologically is that it sits at the intersection of two primal fears: the fear of falling and the fear of the unseen predator. The ocean promises both. It offers the possibility of being pulled down, swallowed into endless depths, and the possibility of being hunted by something you cannot see until it is too late. To combine those fears into one image was to create a monster that needed no proof. It was already present in every shiver, every hesitation, every glance over the side of a ship at night. The endurance of the myth also shows the human need for narrative. Fear without a story is formless, difficult to share, and difficult to pass on. The Kraken gave fear structure. It turned vague unease into a concrete tale, something that could be told to others. To say, "I felt watched in the dark water," is personal and ephemeral. To say, "The Kraken was beneath us," is collective and enduring. The monster became a language for fear, one that could travel across generations. Modern psychology might explain the Kraken in terms of pareidolia, the tendency to see patterns in randomness. A patch of waves becomes a rising back, a floating log becomes a tentacle. But to the men who saw such shapes, the explanation was not error, it was presence. The mind's habit of filling gaps was interpreted not as mistake, but as revelation. What they perceived was real enough to shape their behavior, and in that sense, the Kraken existed regardless of its biology. The fear of the deep also carries symbolic weight. Water has long been associated with the unconscious, with the hidden parts of the mind. To descend into the sea is to descend into mystery, danger, and transformation. The Kraken, as master of that depth, becomes an image of the fears that rise from within. To confront it is to confront the darkness inside oneself, the impulses, desires, and terrors that lurk unseen until they seize us. The monster is thus not only external, but internal, a psychological mirror of the abyss. Even today, when submarines and cameras have penetrated the deep, the fear persists. Photographs of giant squid, sharks in the blackness, and unknown forms caught in sonar do not banish the feeling. If anything, they confirm it. The abyss is still alien, still filled with forms that defy easy classification. The Kraken may not rise to crush ships, but the fear it embodies remains intact. It is the fear of what lies beneath, the dread of a space too vast to master and too dark to illuminate. This psychological power explains why the Kraken's myth has endured longer than many others. It is not simply a tale of an unlikely beast. It is an expression of something fundamental in human experience. As long as the sea remains vast, as long as humans feel small against it, the Kraken will remain a living symbol. Its arms may be mythical, but the fear they represent is real. And from this psychological foundation, the legend expanded further. The Kraken did not remain only an expression of fear, it became an archetype, a recurring symbol of chaos, death, and rebirth. Like Leviathan, it carried meaning beyond the ocean itself, reflecting the cycles of destruction and renewal that define human life. To see the Kraken only as a monster of fear is to miss the deeper current running beneath its legend. Like Leviathan in the Bible, like Tiamat in Mesopotamia, like the Midgard serpent in Norse myth, the Kraken became more than a creature. It was an archetype, a recurring figure that expressed ideas larger than itself. At its core, it represented chaos, death, and the possibility of rebirth. These were not abstract symbols imposed on it from outside. They were already present in the way the sea itself behaved, in the cycles of destruction and renewal that defined maritime life. The Kraken simply gave those cycles a body. Chaos was its most obvious face. The ocean has never been predictable. Calm waters could turn into violent storms without warning, swallowing ships whole. Rich fishing grounds could vanish overnight, leaving villages hungry. Currents, tides, and whirlpools could appear as if by magic, dragging vessels off course or into disaster. For sailors and coastal communities, the sea was the embodiment of disorder, a force that disrupted plans and defied human control. The Kraken condensed that disorder into a single figure. Its arms and whirlpools stood for the unpredictable violence of the sea itself. To say the Kraken had struck was to say that chaos had claimed another victim. But chaos was never the end of the story. In nearly every culture, chaos was tied to creation. Tiamat's body was cut apart to form the heavens and earth. Leviathan was destined to be slain so that its flesh could feed the righteous at the end of time. The Midgard serpents rising at Ragnarok would mark not only destruction, but the birth of a new world. The Kraken fit naturally into this pattern. Its appearances were terrifying, but they also brought abundance. Fish swarmed around it, and clever fishermen could reap enormous catches in its presence. It was both a destroyer and a provider, a source of death and of life. Chaos, in this sense, was not only a threat, but a beginning. This dual role reflected the lived experience of seafaring communities. The same waters that killed also sustained. A storm might wreck boats, but the sea's bounty fed families. To survive meant accepting both sides of this reality. The Kraken, as archetype, reminded people that chaos and creation were inseparable. To encounter it was to face the truth that destruction and renewal were part of the same cycle. Death was the second face of the Kraken. To be taken by it was not just to drown, it was to be claimed by the abyss, to vanish into a space where no human could follow. The sea has always been a grave. Countless ships lie beneath its surface, countless bodies unrecovered. For sailors, to imagine the Kraken dragging men down was to give a name to the fate they all feared. It was not just water that killed. It was a hand, a mouth, a will that reached up and pulled them into darkness. The monster was a way of acknowledging death as part of the sea's order, a figure that explained the loss of those who never returned. But death at sea was rarely seen as final in the way land burials were. The ocean swallowed, but it also transformed. Bodies became part of the food chain, ships became reefs, and life continued. Myths reflected this transformation. Sailors taken by the Kraken were not always described as simply lost. Sometimes they were imagined as entering the sea itself, becoming part of its depths, joining the realm of mystery that lay beneath. In this way, the Kraken was not only a devourer, but a gatekeeper, a figure of passage between the world of the living and the hidden world below. This association with death also reinforced the idea of rebirth. The sea was not only a place of endings, but of beginnings. Storms passed, wrecks decayed, and new voyages began. The Kraken's role as both destroyer and provider made it a perfect symbol of this cycle. To be tested by it and survive was to be renewed, transformed into someone wiser, more seasoned, more worthy. To perish in its grasp was to be returned to the sea, one life feeding the next. Either way, the Kraken marked a turning point. It was never just an enemy. It was a threshold. The archetypal nature of the Kraken can also be seen in the way its image was used. Sailors and storytellers did not describe it only as an external force. They used it as a metaphor for inner struggles, for trials of greed, arrogance, or fear. To resist the Kraken was to resist temptation. To fall to it was to be undone by weakness. This mirrors the archetypal function of monsters across cultures. They are not just beings to be slain. They are mirrors of the human condition, tests that reveal who we are. The Kraken filled this role for those who faced the sea. Its archetypal power also explains its adaptability. When it was absorbed into Christian sermons, it became a symbol of sin and temptation. When it entered natural history, it became a symbol of the unknown in science. When it appeared in literature, it became a metaphor for alien forces that could not be tamed. In each case, it served the same function: to embody the forces of chaos, death, and transformation. The context shifted, but the archetype remained. Modern psychology, influenced by thinkers like Carl Jung, would later identify such figures as part of the collective unconscious, recurring images that appear across cultures because they reflect universal human experiences. The Kraken fits this model perfectly. It is the ocean's version of the dragon, the serpent, the chaos monster. It appears wherever humans face the sea because it embodies what the sea means to us: danger, death, and the possibility of renewal. What makes the Kraken particularly enduring is that it embodies these archetypal themes in ways that remain relevant even as knowledge advances. Science may explain giant squids, but it cannot explain away the feeling of insignificance when staring at the horizon, or the dread of the unseen beneath. The archetype persists because the experience persists. The Kraken still embodies chaos, death, and rebirth, whether in folklore, fiction, or imagination. As the legend spread into literature and art, these archetypal themes were amplified. Writers seized upon the Kraken not just as a monster, but as a symbol, a way to dramatize the forces of destruction and transformation. In poetry, novels, and eventually film, the Kraken became more than a creature of the sea. It became a cultural archetype, a shorthand for the overwhelming power of forces beyond human control. And through that transformation, the Kraken moved fully into the realm of culture, no longer confined to sagas or sermons, but alive in ink, print, and story. Its archetypal weight ensured that it would not fade. Instead, it would thrive in new forms, becoming one of the most recognizable monsters in the modern imagination. When the Kraken passed from maps and sermons into the hands of writers and artists, it entered a new stage of its existence. It was no longer just a rumor whispered among sailors or a warning offered in pulpits. It became part of culture itself, reshaped by poets, novelists, and illustrators who saw in it not just a monster of the sea, but a symbol that could be used in countless ways. From the ink of literature to the screens of modern entertainment, the Kraken evolved into one of the most enduring monsters of all time. The 19th century gave the Kraken its first true literary fame. In 1830, Alfred Lord Tennyson published his sonnet, The Kraken, a poem that transformed the monster from a sailor's terror into a figure of sublime awe. Tennyson described it as lying in the deep, vast, and ancient, sleeping through ages until it would one day rise and die on the surface. His version was less about attacking ships than about representing the mystery of the abyss itself. In his hands, the Kraken became a symbol of the unknown, a sleeping force of nature beyond human reach. The poem resonated because it captured the growing fascination with the deep sea in the Victorian age, when exploration was expanding but mysteries remained vast. Tennyson's Kraken was part of a broader literary trend that embraced the sea as a space of wonder and terror. The Romantic movement had already turned storms, mountains, and forests into symbols of the sublime, forces that dwarfed human beings and inspired awe as much as fear. The Kraken fit perfectly into this landscape. It was the sea's sublime made flesh, a monster that reminded readers of how small they were compared to the natural world. For audiences who no longer lived by fishing or sailing but still dreamed of the ocean, the Kraken was a way to feel that awe without leaving home. Later in the 19th century, Jules Verne gave the Kraken another life in 20,000 Leagues Under the Seas. Verne described battles between Captain Nemo's submarine and giant squids, arms wrapping around the vessel, men fighting for survival. Though Verne referred to giant squids rather than the Kraken by name, the image was unmistakable. His scenes echoed the old engravings of tentacles crushing ships, updated for an age of science and adventure. By grounding the monster in a story of exploration and technology, Werner made it relevant for readers who lived in a world increasingly shaped by science. The Kraken was no longer just myth. It was a foe for modern men and modern machines. Illustrators of the period cemented the image. Engravings in books and magazines showed ships dwarfed by arms, sailors staring in terror as tentacles as thick as masts rose from the water. These images were widely circulated, reaching audiences far from the sea. For many, the Kraken became their first mental picture of the ocean's dangers, more vivid than any description of storms or reefs. Once seen, the image of the tentacled monster was impossible to forget. The 20th century carried the Kraken into new media. Films embraced it as a spectacle, a monster whose sheer size made it perfect for the screen. Early black and white adventure films showed tentacled beasts attacking submarines or coastal villages. Later, as special effects advanced, the Kraken became a staple of fantasy and science fiction. Ray Harryhausen's stop-motion Kraken in the 1981 film Clash of the Titans remains one of the most iconic images of the monster, its arms smashing temples and dragging humans to their doom. Though this Kraken was more reptilian than cephalopod, the association stuck. To release the Kraken became a phrase that carried the weight of myth into modern language. The Kraken also appeared in literature for children and young adults, where its terror was often softened, but its grandeur retained. Stories of sea voyages, pirate adventures, and fantasy quests used the Kraken as the ultimate obstacle, a way to test heroes and create drama. In these tales, the monster was less about theology or science and more about narrative function. It was the climax of the journey, the challenge that forced characters to prove their bravery. As video games emerged as a major storytelling medium, the Kraken found yet another home. Its combination of scale, danger, and iconic tentacles made it a natural boss monster. From early pixelated versions to modern hyper-detailed graphics, players have faced the Kraken in countless virtual seas, battling its arms, avoiding its whirlpools, and trying to survive its grasp. In games, the Kraken functions the same way it did in folklore, as the ultimate test. To defeat it is to prove worth. What makes the Kraken particularly adaptable to modern culture is its flexibility. It can be terrifying, majestic, or even humorous depending on context. In some stories, it is an unstoppable terror. In others, it is a misunderstood giant, a relic of the deep. In advertising and branding, it has even been turned into a playful image used to sell everything from rum to sports teams. Yet even in these lighter versions, its core imagery remains: the arms, the abyss, the association with the ocean's depths. The enduring presence of the Kraken in culture also reflects the human fascination with the unknown. In an age when most of the world's land has been mapped and explored, the ocean remains the great frontier. Stories of the Kraken keep that frontier alive in imagination. Even when audiences know it is fictional, they feel the truth behind it. The sea still hides wonders and dangers we cannot fully grasp. The monster continues to serve as a symbol of that mystery, a reminder that some parts of the world remain beyond control. The Kraken's cultural life has also benefited from its archetypal associations. As a figure of chaos, death, and rebirth, it can be used in almost any narrative that deals with overwhelming forces. Writers and filmmakers use it to represent nature's power, humanity's hubris, or the inevitability of destruction. It appears in comedies, tragedies, fantasies, and science fiction, always carrying the same symbolic weight. It has become less a creature of the north and more a universal icon of the sea. Modern depictions often exaggerate its size beyond anything described in the past, making it capable of pulling entire cities into the water or battling fleets of warships. These exaggerations do not weaken the myth. They strengthen it, keeping it alive for audiences accustomed to spectacles larger than life. The Kraken thrives on scale, and modern media has given it new arenas in which to grow. Yet the most remarkable thing about the Kraken's cultural endurance is that it has never lost its connection to the sea. Unlike dragons, which have flown from mountains into countless fantasy worlds, or vampires, which have shifted from folklore into urban settings, the Kraken remains tied to the ocean. No matter how far it travels in literature or film, it is always of the water, always a creature of the abyss. That consistency anchors it, keeping its symbolism clear even as its form changes.
From Tennyson's poetry to Verne's novels, from engravings to films, from board games to digital worlds, the Kraken has proven itself one of the most versatile monsters in human imagination. Its journey from ink to screen is not just a story of entertainment. It is a story of how myths survive, adapting to new media while retaining their core power. The Kraken continues to reach into our imaginations because it embodies something that no technology, no knowledge can erase: the mystery and terror of the deep. And as culture has embraced it, science has continued its own journey, probing the depths with submarines, cameras, and sonar. The monster that once lived only in tales now has real cousins filmed alive in the abyss. The Kraken's next chapter lies not only in fiction, but in discovery, as the modern exploration of the ocean reveals what truly swims in the dark.
The age of satellites, submarines, and deep-sea cameras has given us a clearer picture of the ocean than any generation before, but it has not erased its mystery. If anything, modern exploration has deepened the sense of awe. The Kraken, once a phantom of maps and myths, now lives in the shadow of real giants captured on film. In the 21st century, we know more about the abyss than ever, yet we still find ourselves haunted by the same question: what else waits in the dark? The deep sea covers more than half of the planet's surface, yet remains the least explored environment on Earth. Trenches plunge deeper than Mount Everest is tall, pressure crushes steel, and light never reaches. For centuries, these depths were beyond imagination. Sailors spoke of monsters because they had no way of knowing what actually lived below. Today, with remotely operated vehicles, sonar mapping, and manned submersibles, we have begun to glimpse that hidden world. What we've seen confirms what the legend suggested, that the deep is home to beings as strange as any monster ever imagined. The first clear images of a living giant squid were a milestone in this exploration. In 2004, Japanese researchers managed to photograph one at nearly 3,000 feet below the surface, capturing its long tentacles reaching into the dark. 8 years later, the first video of a living giant squid was recorded, showing the animal alive and moving, its huge eyes reflecting the faint light of the cameras.
For the first time, the Kraken's closest relative was seen not as a rotting carcass, but as a living presence in the abyss. The sight was both vindication and revelation. Sailors had not invented their monster from nothing. Something real, something enormous, had always been there. The discovery of the colossal squid, even larger than the giant squid, added another layer. Found in the Southern Ocean, these creatures can grow heavier and thicker, with hooks as well as suckers lining their tentacles. Their existence shows that the deep still holds forms of life capable of inspiring awe and terror. A colossal squid pulled from Antarctic waters in 2007 measured over 30 feet long and weighed nearly half a ton. Its eyes were the largest ever recorded in the animal kingdom, designed to detect movement in absolute darkness. To see such a creature is to understand why the Kraken endured for centuries. Reality is monstrous enough, but it is not only squids that make the abyss feel alive with giants. The sperm whale, which hunts them, is itself one of the largest predators to ever live, diving thousands of feet in search of prey. Sharks patrol the depths,
some glowing with bioluminescence, others stretching to lengths that rival buses. Strange fish with fanged jaws and lantern-like lures drift in the black. Jellyfish larger than a man's body pulse silently through the water. The deeper we look, the more alien it becomes. Each discovery reinforces the old sense that the sea is not empty but inhabited, and that we have only begun to understand what dwells there. The persistence of the Kraken in the modern world is tied directly to this sense of unfinished knowledge. Even with satellites mapping the surface of Mars, vast portions of Earth's own ocean floor remain uncharted. Sonar has revealed mountain ranges and trenches no one suspected, but the creatures that live there are still largely unknown. Each expedition brings new species, sometimes tiny, sometimes vast, always strange. To admit that we have not seen it all is to leave room for legends. The Kraken survives because the abyss still keeps its secrets. Deep-sea exploration has also revealed how scale itself changes our perception. A squid 40 feet long is real, measurable, explainable in biological terms. But when viewed in the lightless deep, with tentacles stretching beyond the reach of cameras, it becomes something else. Context transforms it from animal to apparition. For a sailor glimpsing it at the surface centuries ago, its strangeness would have been overwhelming. Even today, scientists who see these giants alive describe the experience with words like awe, dread, and wonder. Knowledge does not cancel emotion, it often amplifies it. Modern technology has also reminded us that even when we capture images, we are only scratching the surface. Cameras illuminate small pockets, submarines descend for brief hours, sonar shows outlines rather than details. The abyss is too vast to conquer. For every giant squid we film, there may be dozens more we never see. For every colossal squid brought to the surface, there may be others larger still. The possibility of undiscovered giants keeps the imagination alive. The Kraken is not only a relic of the past, it is a symbol of what we still do not know. The reality of giants in the deep also shapes how we think about ourselves. To see a squid with eyes the size of dinner plates staring back through the dark is to feel small, vulnerable, and temporary. The abyss reminds us that life is not confined to the surface or to human experience. It thrives in places we cannot live, in forms we can barely comprehend. This realization connects us directly to the sailors who first told Kraken tales. They too felt small against the ocean, too fragile to master its mysteries. The difference is that now, with cameras and submarines, we share their awe with proof in hand. The Kraken's legend also thrives in the modern abyss because we now understand how fragile our own survival is in comparison. Submariners speak of the pressure, the darkness, the silence that envelops them when they descend. Even with the best technology, a mistake means death. The deep remains a hostile environment, indifferent to human presence. To imagine a giant rising from that darkness is to acknowledge the truth. The sea is still more powerful than we are. What exploration has done is not to banish the Kraken, but to shift its meaning. Where once it was proof of divine judgment or sailor's exaggeration, now it is a reminder of how much remains unknown. It is a symbol not only of fear, but of humility, a warning that even in the 21st century, we are still guests in a world we cannot fully claim. The Kraken survives because the abyss itself survives, vast and unexplored. And so the modern abyss offers us both reality and myth. The giant squid is real, the colossal squid is real, and their presence proves that sailors' fears were not fantasy. But beyond them, the ocean still holds possibilities, still whispers of shapes larger, stranger, and unseen. The Kraken lives in that space between what we know and what we imagine, between the image on the camera and the shadow just beyond its light. From this vantage, the final truth becomes clear. The Kraken endures not simply as a monster of the past, not only as a scientific puzzle solved, but as a living paradox. It is both myth and reality, fear
and fascination, past and present. And that paradox is why it still haunts us, even now.
The Kraken has never belonged only to the sea. It has always lived in the human mind, a shape rising from the darkness of imagination as much as from the waves. That is why, after centuries of changing context, myth, sermon, map, science, literature, film, it still remains with us. Other monsters have faded when their environments were explained or when their symbolism no longer fit. The Kraken has endured because it embodies something larger than folklore. It is a paradox, a creature that is both impossible and real, both explained and unexplained, both ancient and modern. That paradox is the reason it still haunts us. At its core, the Kraken represents the tension between knowledge and mystery. For as long as humans have sailed, they have sought to master the ocean with tools, maps, and technology. Each advance reduces risk and increases control, yet the sea remains indifferent. Storms still wreck ships, currents still pull them astray, and depths still conceal life beyond reach. The Kraken embodies that resistance. It is the reminder that no matter how much we know, the ocean will always withhold more. Knowledge explains tentacles, carcasses, and scars, but it cannot explain the feeling of staring into black water at night and wondering what watches back. The paradox is that science makes the Kraken more believable, not less. The existence of giant squids proves that monsters can be real, while the vastness of unexplored depths ensures that greater ones might still wait. The Kraken also persists because it expresses universal human fears, the fear of the abyss, of drowning, of being dragged down into darkness. These are not bound to one time or culture. They live in everyone who has ever felt small before nature, powerless before forces beyond control. The Kraken gathers those fears into one image, making them visible, nameable, and transmissible. To tell its story is to tell the story of vulnerability itself. That is why its arms still reach across centuries. It does not depend on belief in literal monsters. It depends on belief in danger, and that belief will never vanish. At the same time, the Kraken carries fascination as much as fear. Part of what haunts us is not the terror of destruction, but the allure of the unknown. The abyss is frightening because it hides death, but it also invites discovery. The Kraken embodies that duality. It is both the danger that takes life and the mystery that calls us to explore. We fear its grasp, but we also want to glimpse it, to see the giant rise from the dark. In this way, the monster is a paradox of attraction and repulsion. We want it to exist, even as we dread the consequences of meeting it. The paradox extends to its symbolism. The Kraken is chaos, but also order. It punishes greed and arrogance, enforcing restraint upon those who face it. It brings death, but also life, luring fish to its body and feeding communities. It represents the end of voyages, but also the renewal of those who survive it. It is both moral allegory and zoological specimen, both myth and animal. Few figures can hold so many contradictions without collapsing. The Kraken thrives precisely because it does not resolve. It is never one thing. It is always both. In literature and culture, this paradox gives it endless adaptability. Writers can use it as a terror, a symbol of sin, a metaphor for mystery, or a spectacle of adventure. Filmmakers can make it terrifying or majestic, humorous or sublime. Game designers can turn it into an obstacle, a test, or a reward. Each version is different, yet all are recognizable. The Kraken does not need consistency of form because its meaning lies in contradiction. That flexibility ensures it will never grow stale. Psychologically, the Kraken haunts us because it mirrors the hidden parts of ourselves. The ocean has always been a metaphor for the unconscious, the vast, uncharted realm of thoughts, fears, and desires. The Kraken, rising from the depths, represents what emerges when that unconscious is stirred. It is the shadow, the part of us we cannot see but know exists, capable of overwhelming us if ignored. To fear the Kraken is to fear ourselves, and to imagine its defeat is to imagine mastery of what lies within. That inner resonance ensures the monster will never vanish, no matter how far science advances. Culturally, the Kraken survives because the sea itself remains untamed. We may fly across continents in hours, drill into mountains, and map planets with telescopes, but the ocean continues to resist mastery. Submarines explore only fragments. Cables and ships crisscross its surface, but its depths remain alien. As long as the ocean is untamed, the Kraken will live. It is the symbol of that untamable quality, the voice of the abyss reminding us that our dominion is limited. Even language shows how deeply the Kraken has embedded itself. To release the Kraken has become shorthand for unleashing overwhelming force, for letting loose chaos too great to control. The phrase appears in sports, politics, marketing, and casual speech, detached from its literal meaning, yet retaining its symbolic power. Few myths achieve that kind of linguistic immortality. It speaks to how naturally the Kraken fits our need for an image of vast, uncontrollable might. The Kraken also haunts us because it blurs the line between reality and imagination in a way that few other monsters do. Dragons have no biological counterpart. Vampires and werewolves belong to the realm of fantasy. But the Kraken's cousins are real. Giant squids swim in the deep. Colossal squids battle whales. Carcasses wash ashore with arms longer than men are tall. The myth is stitched from truth, and truth is coloured by myth. That interweaving makes it impossible to dismiss. The Kraken is both a fairy tale and a zoological fact, a monster that lives on both sides of the boundary. And perhaps that is the ultimate reason the Kraken still haunts us. It is not only a relic of the past, nor only a marvel of science, nor only a story for books and films. It is all of these at once. It is the convergence of myth and reality, the place where fear, wonder, and knowledge meet. It lives because it reflects the human condition, our hunger to know, our fear of what we cannot control, our fascination with what lies beyond sight. The Kraken is not just a sea monster. It is a mirror of our relationship with the unknown. When we speak of the Kraken today, we are not really asking whether it exists. We are asking whether mystery still exists. We are asking whether there are still forces large enough to humble us, still places where imagination must stand in for knowledge. The answer, as long as the ocean endures, will always be yes. The Kraken will haunt us because the abyss will always be deeper than our reach. And so the legend continues, as vivid now as in the days of sagas and sermons. The Kraken's arms still rise in literature, its shadow still falls in films, its name still carries weight in speech. It remains both ancient and modern, both monster and metaphor, both real and unreal. It is the living paradox of the sea, and as long as humans sail, explore, and dream, it will never sink beneath the waves for good.